Slowly, Ender pulled his legs under him with a faint groan of pain. He knelt on all fours for a moment, recovering. Then his right arm flashed out, reaching for his enemy. The old man quickly danced back, and Ender's hand closed on air as his teacher's foot shot forward to catch Ender on the chin. Ender's chin wasn't there. He was lying flat on his back, spinning on the floor, and during the moment that his teacher was off balance from his kick, Ender's feet smashed into the old man's other leg. He fell in a heap, but close enough to strike out and hit Ender in the face. Ender couldn't find an arm or a leg that held still long enough to be grabbed, and in the meantime blows were landing on his back and arms. Ender was smaller. He couldn't reach past the old man's flailing limbs. Finally he managed to pull away and scramble back near the door. The old man was sitting cross-legged again, but now the apathy was gone. He was smiling. "Better this time, boy, but slow. You will have to be better with a fleet than you are with your body, or no one will be safe with you in command. Lesson learned?" Ender nodded slowly. He ached in 100 places. "Good," said the old man. "Then we'll never have to have such a battle again. All the rest with the simulator. I will program your battles now, not the computer. I will devise the strategy of your enemy, and you will learn to be quick and discover what tricks the enemy has for you. Remember, boy, from now on, the enemy is more clever than you. From now on, the enemy is stronger than you. From now on, you are always about to lose." The old man's face grew serious again. "You will be about to lose, Ender, but you will win. You will learn to defeat the enemy. He will teach you how." The teacher got up. "In this school it has always been the practice for a young student to be chosen by an older student. The two become companions, and the older boy teaches the younger one everything he knows. Always they fight, always they compete, always they are together. I have chosen you." Ender spoke as the old man walked to the door. "You're too old to be a student." "One is never too old to be a student of the enemy. I have learned from the buggers. You will learn from me." As the old man palmed the door open, Ender leaped into the air and kicked him in the small of the back with both feet. He hit hard enough that he rebounded onto his feet as the old man cried out and collapsed on the floor. The old man got up slowly, holding on to the door handle, his face contorted with pain. He seemed disabled, but Ender didn't trust him. Yet, in spite of his suspicion, he was caught off guard by the old man's speed. In a moment, he found himself on the floor near the opposite wall, his nose and lip bleeding where his face had hit the bed. He was able to turn enough to see the old man standing in the doorway, wincing and holding his back. The old man grinned. Ender grinned back. "Teacher," he said, "do you have a name?" "Mazer Rackham," said the old man. Then he was gone. From then on, Ender was either with Mazer Rackham or alone. The old man rarely spoke, but he was there. At meals, at tutorials, at the simulator, in his room at night. Sometimes Mazer would leave, but always when Mazer wasn't there, the door was locked and no one came in until Mazer returned. Ender went through a week in which he called him Jailer Rackham. Mazer answered to the name as readily as to his own, and showed no sign that it bothered him at all. Ender soon gave it up. There were compensations. Mazer took Ender through the videos of the old battles from the first invasion and the disastrous defeats of the IF in the second invasion. These were not pieced together from the censored public videos, but whole and continuous. Since many videos were working in the major battles, they studied bugger tactics and strategies from many angles. For the first time in his life, a teacher was pointing out things that Ender had not already seen for himself. For the first time, Ender had found a living mind he could admire. "Why aren't you dead?" Ender asked him. "You fought your battle 70 years ago. I don't think you're even 60 years old." "Oh, the miracle of relativity," said Mazer. "They kept me here for 20 years after the battle, even though I begged them to let me command one of the starships they launched against the bugger home planet and the bugger colonies. Then they I came to understand some things about the way soldiers behave in the stress of battle. What things? You've never been taught enough psychology to understand. Enough to say that they realized that even though I would never be able to command the fleet, I'd be dead before the fleet even arrived. I was still the only person able to understand the things I understood about the buggers. I was, they realized, the only person who had ever defeated the buggers by intelligence rather than luck. They needed me here to teach the person who would command the fleet. So they sent you out in a starship, got you up to a relativistic speed, and then I turned around and came home. A very dull voyage, Ender. 50 years in space. Officially, only 8 years passed for me, but it felt like 500. All so I could teach the next commander everything I knew. Am I to be the commander, then? Let's say that you are our best bet at present. There are others being prepared, too? No. That makes me the only choice, then, doesn't it? Mazer shrugged. Except you're still alive, aren't you? Why not you? Mazer shook his head. Why not? You won before. I cannot be the commander for good and sufficient reasons. Show me how you beat the buggers, Mazer. Mazer's face went inscrutable. You've shown me every other battle 7 times at least. I think I've seen ways to beat what the buggers did before, but you've never shown me how you actually did beat them. The video is a very tightly kept secret, Ender. I know. I've pieced it together partly. You with your tiny reserve force and their armada, those great big heavy-bellied starships launching their swarms of fighters. You dart in at one ship, fire at it, and explosion. That's where they always stop the clips. After that, it's just soldiers going into bugger ships and already finding them dead inside. Mazer grinned. So much for tightly kept secrets. Come on, let's watch the video. They were alone in the video room, and Ender palmed the door locked. All right, let's watch. The video showed exactly what Ender had pieced together. Mazer's suicidal plunge into the heart of the enemy formation, the single explosion, and then nothing. Mazer's ship went on, dodged the shockwave, and wove his way among the other bugger ships. They did not fire on him. They did not change course. 2 of them crashed into each other and exploded, a needless collision that either pilot could have avoided. Neither made the slightest movement. Mazer sped up the action, skipped ahead. We waited for 3 hours, he said. Nobody could believe it. Then the IF ships began approaching the bugger starships. Marines began their cutting and boarding operations. The videos showed the buggers already dead at their posts. So you see, said Mazer, you already knew all there was to see. Why did it happen? Nobody knows. I have my personal opinions, but there are plenty of scientists who tell me I'm less than qualified to have opinions. You're the one who won the battle. I thought that qualified me to comment too, but you know how it is. Xenobiologists and xenopsychologists can't accept the idea that a star pilot scooped them by sheer guesswork. I think they all hate me because after they saw these videos, they had to live out the rest of their natural lives here on Eros. Security, you know. They weren't happy. Tell me. The buggers don't talk. They think to each other, and it's instantaneous, like the phonetic effect, like the Ansible. But most people always thought that meant a controlled communication, like language. I think you a thought, and then you answer me. I never believed that. It's too immediate, the way they respond together to things. You've seen the videos. They aren't conversing and deciding among possible courses of action. Every ship acts like part of a single organism. It responds the way your body responds during combat, different parts automatically, thoughtlessly doing everything they're supposed to do. They aren't having a mental conversation between people with different thought processes. All their thoughts are present, together, at once. A single person, and each bugger is like a hand or a foot. Yes. I wasn't the first person to suggest it, but I was the first person to believe it. And something else. Something so childish and stupid that the xenobiologists laughed me to silence when I said it after the battle. The buggers are bugs. They're like ants and bees. A queen, the workers. That was maybe 100 million years ago, but that's how they started, that kind of pattern. It's a sure thing none of the buggers we saw had any way of making more little buggers, so when they evolved this ability to think together, wouldn't they still keep the queen? Wouldn't the queen still be the center of the group? Why would that ever change? So it's the queen who controls the whole group. I had evidence too, not evidence that any of them could see. It wasn't there in the first invasion because that was exploratory, but the second invasion was a colony to set up a new hive or whatever. And so they brought a queen. The videos of the second invasion, when they were destroying our fleets out in the comet shell, he began to call them up and display the buggers' patterns. Show me the queen's ship. It was subtle. Ender couldn't see it for a long time. The bugger ships kept moving, all of them. There was no obvious flagship, no apparent nerve center, but gradually, as Mazer played the videos over and over again, Ender began to see the way that all the movements focused on radiated from a center point. The center point shifted, but it was obvious, after he looked long enough, that the eyes of the fleet, the eye of the fleet, the perspective from which all decisions were being made, was one particular ship. He pointed it out. You see it. I see it. That makes two people out of all those who have seen this video, but it's true, isn't it? They make that ship move just like any other ship. They know it's their weak point. But you're right. That's the queen. But then you'd think that when you went for it, they would have immediately focused all their power on you. They could have blown you out of the sky. I know. That part I don't understand. Not that they didn't try to stop me, they were firing at me, but it's as if they really couldn't believe until it was too late that I would actually kill the queen. Maybe in their world, queens are never killed, only captured, only checkmated. I did something they didn't think an enemy would ever do. And when she died, the others all died? No, they just went stupid. The first ships we boarded, the buggers were still alive, organically. But they didn't move, didn't respond to anything, even when our scientists vivisected some of them to see if we could learn a few more things about buggers. After a while, they all died. No will. There's nothing in those little bodies when the queen is gone. Why don't they believe you? Because we didn't find a queen. She got blown to pieces. Fortunes of war. Biology takes a second place to survival. But some of them are coming around to my way of thinking. You can't live in this place without the evidence staring you in the face. What evidence is there in Eros? Ender, look around you. Human beings didn't carve this place. We like taller ceilings, for one thing. This was the buggers' advance post in the first invasion. They carved this place out before we even knew they were here. We're living in a bugger hive, but we already paid our rent. It cost the Marines 1,000 lives to clear them out of these honeycombs, room by room. The buggers fought for every meter of it. Now Ender understood why the rooms had always felt wrong to him. I knew this place wasn't a human place. This was the treasure trove. If they had known we would win that first war, they probably would never have built this place. We learned gravity manipulation because they enhanced the gravity here. We learned efficient use of stellar energy because they blacked out this planet. In fact, that's how we discovered them. In a period of 3 days, Eros gradually disappeared from telescopes. We sent a tug to find out why. It found out. The tug transmitted its videos, including the buggers boarding and slaughtering the crew. It kept right on transmitting through the entire bugger examination of the boat. Not until they finally dismantled the entire tug did the transmissions stop. It was their blindness. They never had to transmit anything by machine. And so with the crew dead, it didn't occur to them that anybody could be watching. Why did they kill the crew? Why not? To them, losing a few crew members would be like clipping your nails, nothing to get upset about. They probably thought they were routinely shutting down our communications by turning off the workers running the tug, not murdering living, sentient beings with an independent genetic future. Murder's no big deal to them. Only queen killing, really, is murder, because only queen killing closes off a genetic path. So they didn't know what they were doing. Don't start apologizing for them, Ender. Just because they didn't know they were killing human beings doesn't mean they weren't killing human beings. We do have a right to defend ourselves as best we can, and the only way we found that works is killing the buggers before they kill us. Think of it this way. In all the bugger wars so far, they've killed thousands and thousands of living, thinking beings. And in all those wars, we've killed only one. If you hadn't killed the Queen, Mazer, would we have lost the war? I'd say the odds would have been 3-2 against us. I still think I could have trashed their fleet pretty badly before they burnt us out. They have great response time and a lot of firepower, but we have a few advantages too. Every single one of our ships contains an intelligent human being who's thinking on his own. Every one of us is capable of coming up with a brilliant solution to a problem. They can only come up with one brilliant solution at a time. The buggers think fast, but they aren't smart all over. But on our side, even when some incredibly timid and stupid commanders lost the major battles of the second invasion, some of their subordinates were able to do real damage to the bugger fleet. What about when our invasion reaches them? Will we just get the Queen again? The buggers didn't learn interstellar travel by being dumb. That was a strategy that could work only once. I suspect that we'll never get near a Queen unless we actually make it to their home planet. After all, the Queen doesn't have to be with them to direct a battle. The Queen only has to be present to have little baby buggers. The second invasion was a colony. The Queen was coming to populate the Earth. But this time, no, that won't work. We'll have to beat them fleet by fleet. And because they have the resources of dozens of star systems to draw on, my guess is they'll outnumber us by a lot in every battle. Ender remembered his battle against 2 armies at once, and I thought they were cheating. When the real war begins, it'll be like that every time, and there won't be any gate I can go for. We've only got 2 things going for us, Ender. We don't have to aim particularly well. Our weapons have great spread. Then we aren't using the nuclear missiles from the first and second invasions. Doctor device is much more powerful. Nuclear weapons, after all, were weak enough to be used on Earth at one time. The little doctor could never be used on a planet. Still, I wish I'd had one during the second invasion. How does it work? I don't know. Not well enough to build one. At the focal point of 2 beams, it sets up a field in which molecules can't hold together anymore. Electrons can't be shared. How much physics do you know at that level? We spent most of our time on astrophysics, but I know enough to get the idea. The field spreads out in a sphere, but it gets weaker the farther it spreads, except that where it actually runs into a lot of molecules, it gets stronger and starts over. The bigger the ship, the stronger the new field. So each time the field hits a ship, it sends out a new sphere, and if their ships are too close together, it can set up a chain that wipes them all out. Then the field dies down, the molecules come back together, and where you had a ship, you now have a lump of dirt with a lot of iron molecules in it. No radioactivity, no mess, just dirt. We may be able to trap them close together on the first battle, but they learn fast. They'll keep their distance from each other. So Dr. Device isn't a missile. I can't shoot around corners. That's right. Missiles wouldn't do any good now. We learned a lot from them in the first invasion, but they also learned from us how to set up the ecstatic shield, for instance. The little doctor penetrates the shield? As if it weren't there. You can't see through the shield to aim and focus the beams, but since the generator of the ecstatic shield is always in the exact center, it isn't hard to figure it out. Why haven't I ever been trained with this? You always have. We just let the computer tend to it for you. Your job is to get into a superior strategic position and choose the target. The shipboard computers are much better at aiming the doctor than you are. Why is it called Dr. Device? When it was developed, it was called a Molecular Detachment Device, MD device. Ender still didn't understand. MD. The initials stand for Medical Doctor, too. MD device, therefore, Doctor Device. It was a joke. Ender didn't see what was funny about it. They had changed the simulator. He could still control the perspective and the degree of detail, but there were no ship's controls anymore. Instead, it was a new panel of levers, and a small headset with earphones and a small microphone. The technician who was waiting there quickly explained how to wear the headset. "But how do I control the ships?" asked Ender. Mazer explained. He wasn't going to control ships anymore. "You've reached the next phase of your training. You have experience in every level of strategy, but now it's time for you to concentrate on commanding an entire fleet. As you worked with toon leaders in battle school, so now you will work with squadron leaders. You have been assigned 36 such leaders to train. You must teach them intelligent tactics. You must learn their strengths and limitations. You must make them into a whole." "When will they come here?" "They're already in place in their own simulators. You will speak to them through the headset. The new levers on your control panel enable you to see from the perspective of any of your squadron leaders. This more closely duplicates the conditions you might encounter in a real battle, where you will know only what your ships can see." "How can I work with squadron leaders I never see?" "And why would you need to see them?" "To know who they are, how they think." "You'll learn who they are and how they think from the way they work with the simulator. But even so, I think you won't be concerned. They're listening to you right now. Put on the headset so you can hear them." Ender put on the headset. "Salam," said a whisper in his ears. "Alai," said Ender. "And me, the dwarf, Bean. And Petra and Dink, Crazy Tom, Shen, Hot Soup, Fly Molo, Karn Karbi, all the best students Ender had fought with or fought against, every one that Ender had trusted in battle school. "I didn't know you were here," he said. "I didn't know you were coming." "They've been flogging us through the simulator for 3 months now," said Dink. "You'll find that I'm by far the best tactician," said Petra. "Dink tries, but he has the mind of a child." So they began working together, each squadron leader commanding individual pilots, and Ender commanding the squadron leaders. They learned many ways of working together as the simulator forced them to try different situations. Sometimes the simulator gave them a larger fleet to work with. Ender set them up then in 3 or 4 toons that consisted of 3 or 4 squadrons each. Sometimes the simulator gave them a single starship with its 12 fighters, and he chose 3 squadron leaders with 4 fighters each. It was pleasure. It was play. The computer-controlled enemy was none too bright, and they always won despite their mistakes, their miscommunications. But in the 3 weeks they practiced together, Ender came to know them very well. Dink, who deftly carried out instructions but was slow to improvise. Bean, who couldn't control large groups of ships effectively, but could use a few like a scalpel, reacting beautifully to anything the computer threw at him. Alai, who was almost as good a strategist as Ender and could be entrusted to do well with half a fleet and only vague instructions. The better Ender knew them, the faster he could deploy them, the better he could use them. The simulator would display the situation on the screen. In that moment, Ender learned for the first time what his own fleet would consist of and how the enemy fleet was deployed. It took him only a few minutes now to call the squadron leaders that he needed, assign them to certain ships or groups of ships, and give them their assignments. Then, as the battle progressed, he would skip from one leader's point of view to another's, making suggestions and occasionally giving orders as the need arose. Since the others could see only their own battle perspective, he would sometimes give them orders that made no sense to them, But they, too, learned to trust Ender. If he told them to withdraw, they withdrew, knowing that either they were in an exposed position or their withdrawal might entice the enemy into a weakened posture. They also knew that Ender trusted them to do as they judged best when he gave them no orders. If their style of fighting were not right for the situation they were placed in, Ender would not have chosen them for that assignment. The trust was complete, the working of the fleet quick and responsive. And at the end of 3 weeks, Mazer showed him a replay of their most recent battle, only this time from the enemy's point of view. This is what he saw as you attacked. What does it remind you of? The quickness of response, for instance. We look like a bugger fleet. You match them, Ender. You're as fast as they are. And here, look at this. Ender watched as all his squadrons moved at once, each responding to its own situation, all guided by Ender's overall command, but daring, improvising, feinting, attacking with an independence no bugger fleet had ever shown. The bugger hive mind is very good, but it can only concentrate on a few things at once. All your squadrons can concentrate a keen intelligence on what they're doing, and what they've been assigned to do is also guided by a clever mind. So you see that you do have some advantages. Superior, though not irresistible weaponry, comparable speed, and greater available intelligence. These are your advantages. Your disadvantage is that you will always be outnumbered. And after each battle, your enemy will learn more about you, how to fight you, and those changes will be put into effect instantly. Ender waited for his conclusion. So, Ender, we will now begin your education. We have programmed the computer to simulate the kinds of situations we might expect in encounters with the enemy. We are using the movement patterns we saw in the second invasion, but instead of mindlessly following these same patterns, I will be controlling the enemy simulation. At first, you will see easy situations that you are expected to win handily. Learn from them, because I will always be there, one step ahead of you, programming more difficult and advanced patterns into the computer so that your next battle is more difficult, so that you are pushed to the limit of your abilities. And beyond? The time is short. You must learn as quickly as you can. When I gave myself to starship travel, just so I would still be alive when you appeared, my wife and children all died. And my grandchildren were my own age when I came back. I had nothing to say to them. I was cut off from all the people that I loved, everything I knew, living in this alien catacomb, and forced to do nothing of importance but teach student after student, each one so hopeful, each one ultimately a weakling, a failure. I teach, but no one learns. You too have great promise, like so many students before you, but the seeds of failure may be in you too. It's my job to find them, to destroy you if I can. And believe me, Ender, if you can be destroyed, I can do it. So I'm not the first? No, of course you're not. But you're the last. If you don't learn, there'll be no time to find anyone else. So I have hope for you, if only because you are the only one left to hope for. What about the others, my squadron leaders? Which of them is fit to take your place? A lie? Be honest. Ender had no answer then. I am not a happy man, Ender. Humanity does not ask us to be happy. It merely asks us to be brilliant on its behalf. Survival first, then happiness, as we can manage it. So, Ender, I hope you do not bore me during your training with complaints that you are not having fun. Take what pleasure you can in the interstices of your work, but your work is first. Learning is first. Winning is everything, because without it there is nothing. When you can give me back my dead wife, Ender, then you can complain to me about what this education cost you. I wasn't trying to get out of anything. Oh, but you will, Ender, because I am going to grind you down to dust, if I can. I am going to hit you with everything I can imagine, and I will have no mercy, because when you face the buggers, they will think of things I can't imagine, and compassion for human beings is impossible for them. You can't grind me down, Mazer. Oh, can't I? Because I'm stronger than you. Mazer smiled. We'll see about that, Ender. Mazer wakened him before morning. The clock said 03:40, and Ender felt groggy as he padded along the corridor behind Mazer. Early to bed and early to rise, Mazer intoned, makes a man stupid and blind in the eyes. He had been dreaming that buggers were vivisecting him, only instead of cutting open his body, they were cutting up his memories and displaying them like holographs and trying to make sense of them. It was a very odd dream, and Ender couldn't easily shake loose of it, even as he walked through the tunnels to the simulator room. The buggers tormented him in his sleep, and Mazer wouldn't leave him alone when he was awake. Between the two of them he had no rest. Ender forced himself awake. Apparently Mazer meant it when he said he meant to break Ender down, and forcing him to play when tired and sleepy was just the sort of cheap and easy trick Ender should have expected. Well, today it wouldn't work. He got to the simulator and found his squadron leaders already on the wire, waiting for him. There was no enemy yet, so he divided them into two armies and began a mock battle, commanding both sides so he could control the test that each of his leaders was going through. They began slowly, but soon were vigorous and alert. Then the simulator field went blank. The ships disappeared, and everything changed at once. At the near edge of the simulator field, they could see the shapes drawn in holographic light of 3 starships from the human fleet. Each would have 12 fighters. The enemy, obviously aware of the human presence, had formed the globe with a single ship at the center. Ender was not fooled. It would not be a queen ship. The buggers outnumbered Ender's fighter force by 2-1, but they were also grouped much closer together than they should have been. Dr. Device would be able to do much more damage than the enemy expected. Ender selected one starship, made it blink in the simulator field, and spoke into the microphone. Alai, this is yours. Assign Petra and Vlad to the fighters as you wish. He assigned the other 2 starships with their fighter forces, except for 1 fighter from each starship that he reserved for Bean. Slip the wall and get below them, Bean, unless they start chasing you. Then run back to the reserves for safety. Otherwise, get in a place where I can call on you for quick results. Alai, form your force into a compact assault at one point on their globe. Don't fire until I tell you. This is maneuver only. This one's easy, Ender, Alai said. It's easy, so why not be careful? I'd like to do this without the loss of a single ship. Ender grouped his reserves in 2 forces that shadowed Alai at a distance. Bean was already off the simulator, though Ender occasionally flipped to Bean's point of view to keep track of where he was. It was Alai, however, who played the delicate game with the enemy. He was in a bullet-shaped formation and probed the enemy globe. Wherever he came near, the bugger ships pulled back as if to draw him in toward the ship in the center. Alai skimmed to the side. The bugger ships kept up with him, withdrawing wherever he was close, returning to the sphere pattern when he had passed. Feint, withdraw, skim the globe to another point, withdraw again, feint again. And then Ender said, Go on in, Alai. His bullet started in, while he said to Ender, You know they'll just let me through and surround me and eat me alive. Just ignore that ship in the middle. Whatever you say, boss. Sure enough, the globe began to contract. Ender brought the reserves forward. The enemy ships concentrated on the side of the globe nearer the reserves. Attack them there, where they're most concentrated, Ender said. This defies 4,000 years of military history, said Alai, moving his fighters forward. We're supposed to attack where we outnumber them. In this simulation, they obviously don't know what our weapons can do. It'll only work once, but let's make it spectacular. Fire at will. Alai did. The simulation responded beautifully. First 1 or 2, then a dozen, then most of the enemy ships exploded in dazzling light as the field leapt from ship to ship in the tight formation. Stay out of the way, Ender said. The ships on the far side of the globe formation were not affected by the chain reaction, but it was a simple matter to hunt them down and destroy them. Bean took care of the stragglers that tried to escape toward his end of space. The battle was over. It had been easier than most of their recent exercises. Mazer shrugged when Ender told him so. This is a simulation of a real invasion. There had to be one battle in which they didn't know what we could do. Now your work begins. Try not to be too arrogant about the victory. I'll give you the real challenges soon enough. Ender practiced 10 hours a day with his squadron leaders, but not all at once. He gave them a few hours in the afternoon to rest. Simulated battles under Mazer's supervision came every 2 or 3 days, and as Mazer had promised, they were never so easy again. The enemy quickly abandoned its attempt to surround Ender, and never again grouped its forces closely enough to allow a chain reaction. There was something new every time, something harder. Sometimes Ender had only a single starship and 8 fighters. Once the enemy dodged through an asteroid belt. Sometimes the enemy left stationary traps, large installations that blew up if Ender brought one of his squadrons too close, often crippling or destroying some of Ender's ships. "You cannot absorb losses," Mazer shouted at him after one battle. "When you get into the real battle, you won't have the luxury of an infinite supply of computer-generated fighters. You will have what you brought with you and nothing more. Now get used to fighting without unnecessary waste." "It wasn't unnecessary waste," Ender said. "I can't win battles if I'm so terrified of losing a ship that I never take any risks." Mazer smiled. "Excellent, Ender. You're beginning to learn. But in a real battle, you would have superior officers and, worst of all, civilians shouting those things at you. Now, if the enemy had been at all bright, they would have caught you here and taken Tom's squadron." Together they went over the battle. In the next practice, Ender would show his leaders what Mazer had shown him, and they'd learn to cope with it the next time they saw it. They thought they had been ready before, that they had worked smoothly together as a team. Now, though, having fought through real challenges together, they all began to trust each other more than ever, and battles became exhilarating. They told Ender that the ones who weren't actually playing would come into the simulator rooms and watch. Ender imagined what it would be like to have his friends there with him, cheering or laughing or gasping with apprehension. Sometimes he thought it would be a great distraction, but other times he wished for it with all his heart. Even when he had spent his days lying out in the sunlight on a raft in a lake, he had not been so lonely. Mazer Rackham was his companion, was his teacher, but was not his friend. He made no complaint, though. Mazer had told him there would be no pity, and his private unhappiness meant nothing to anyone. Most of the time it meant nothing even to Ender. He kept his mind on the game, trying to learn from the battles, and not just the particular lessons of that battle, but what the buggers might have done if they had been more clever, and how Ender would react if they did it in the future. He lived with past battles and future battles both, waking and sleeping, and he drove his squadron leaders with an intensity that occasionally provoked rebelliousness. "You're too kind to us," said Eli one day. "Why don't you get annoyed with us for not being brilliant every moment of every practice? If you keep coddling us like this, we'll think you like us." Some of the others laughed into their microphones. Ender recognized the irony, of course, and answered with a long silence. When he finally spoke, he ignored Eli's complaint. "Again," he said, and this time without self-pity. They did it again, and did it right. But as their trust in Ender as a commander grew, their friendship, remembered from the battle school days, gradually disappeared. It was to each other that they became close. It was with each other that they exchanged confidences. Ender was their teacher and commander, as distant from them as Mazer was from him, and as demanding. They fought all the better for it, and Ender was not distracted from his work. At least not while he was awake. As he drifted off to sleep each night, it was with thoughts of the simulator playing through his mind. But in the night he thought of other things. Often he remembered the corpse of the giant decaying steadily. He did not remember it, though, in the pixels of the picture on his desk. Instead, it was real, the faint odor of death still lingering near it. Things were changed in his dreams. The little village that had grown up between the giant's ribs was composed of buggers now, and they saluted him gravely, like gladiators greeting Caesar before they died for his entertainment. He did not hate the buggers in his dream. And even though he knew that they had hidden their queen from him, he did not try to search for her. He always left the giant's body quickly, and when he got to the playground, the children were always there, wolven and mocking. They wore faces that he knew. Sometimes Peter, and sometimes Bonzo, sometimes Stilson and Bernard. Just as often, though, the savage creatures were Eli and Shen, Dink and Petra. Sometimes one of them would be Valentine, and in his dream he also shoved her under the water and waited for her to drown. She writhed in his hands, fought to come up, but at last was still. He dragged her out of the lake and onto the raft, where she lay with her face in the rictus of death. He screamed and wept over her, crying again and again that it was a game he was only playing. Then Mazer Rackham shook him awake. "You were calling out in your sleep," he said. "Sorry," Ender said. "Never mind. It's time for another battle." Steadily the pace increased. There were usually 2 battles a day now, and Ender held practices to a minimum. He would use the time while the others rested to pore over the replays of past games, trying to spot his own weaknesses, trying to guess what would happen next. Sometimes he was fully prepared for the enemy's innovations, sometimes he was not. "I think you're cheating," Ender told Mazer one day. "Oh?" "You can observe my practice sessions. You can see what I'm working on. You seem to be ready for everything I do." "Most of what you see is computer simulations," Mazer said. "The computer is programmed to respond to your innovations only after you use them once in battle. Then the computer is cheating. You need to get more sleep, Ender." But he could not sleep. He lay awake longer and longer each night, and his sleep was less restful. He woke too often in the night. Whether he was waking up to think more about the game or to escape from his dreams, he wasn't sure. It was as if someone rode him in his sleep, forcing him to wander through his worst memories, to live in them again as if they were real. Nights were so real that days began to seem dreamlike to him. He began to worry that he would not think clearly enough, that he would be too tired when he played. Always, when the game began, the intensity of it awoke him. But if his mental abilities began to slip, he wondered, would he notice it? And he seemed to be slipping. He never had a battle anymore in which he did not lose at least a few fighters. Several times the enemy was able to trick him into exposing more weakness than he meant to. Other times the enemy was able to wear him down by attrition until his victory was as much a matter of luck as strategy. Mazer would go over the game with a look of contempt on his face. "Look at this," he would say. "You didn't have to do this." And Ender would return to practice with his leaders, trying to keep up their morale, but sometimes letting slip his disappointment with their weaknesses, the fact that they made mistakes. "Sometimes we make mistakes," Petra whispered to him once. It was a plea for help. "And sometimes we don't," Ender answered her. If she got help, it would not be from him. He would teach, let her find her friends among the others. Then came a battle that nearly ended in disaster. Petra led her force too far. They were exposed, and she discovered it in a moment when Ender wasn't with her. In only a few moments she had lost all but 2 of her ships. Ender found her then, ordered her to move them in a certain direction. She didn't answer. There was no movement, and in a moment those 2 fighters too would be lost. Ender knew at once that he had pushed her too hard. Because of her brilliance, he had called on her to play far more often and under much more demanding circumstances than all but a few of the others. But he had no time now to worry about Petra or to feel guilty about what he had done to her. He called on Crazy Tom to command the 2 remaining fighters, then went on, trying to salvage the battle. Petra had occupied a key position, and now all of Ender's strategy came apart. If the enemy had not been too eager and clumsy in exploiting their advantage, Ender would have lost. But Shen was able to catch a group of the enemy in too tight a formation and took them out with a single chain reaction. Crazy Tom brought his 2 surviving fighters in through the gap and caused havoc with the enemy, and though his ships, and Shen's as well, were finally destroyed, Fly Molo was able to mop up and complete the victory. At the end of the battle, he could hear Petra crying out, trying to get a microphone. "Tell him I'm sorry. I was just so tired. I couldn't think. That was all. Tell Ender I'm sorry." She was not there for the next few practices, and when she did come back, she was not as quick as she had been, not as daring. Much of what had made her a good commander was lost. Ender couldn't use her anymore, except in routine, closely supervised assignments. She was no fool. She knew what had happened. But she also knew that Ender had no other choice, and told him so. The fact remained that she had broken, and she was far from being the weakest of his squad leaders. It was a warning. He could not press his commanders more than they could bear. Now, instead of using his leaders whenever he needed their skills, he had to keep in mind how often they had fought. He had to spell them off, which meant that sometimes he went into battle with commanders he trusted a little less. As he eased the pressure on them, he increased the pressure on himself. Late one night he woke up in pain. There was blood on his pillow, the taste of blood in his mouth. His fingers were throbbing. He saw that in his sleep he had been gnawing on his own fist. The blood was still flowing smoothly. "Mazer," he called. Rackham woke up and called at once for a doctor. As the doctor treated the wound, Mazer said, "I don't care how much you eat, Ender. Self-cannibalism won't get you out of this school." "I was asleep," Ender said. "I don't want to get out of command school." "Good. The others, the ones who didn't make it, what are you talking about?" "Before me. Your other students who didn't make it through the training, what happened to them?" "They didn't make it, that's all. We don't punish the ones who fail. They just don't go on." "Like Bonzo?" "Bonzo." "He went home." "Not like Bonzo." "What then? What happened to them? When they failed? Why does it matter, Ender?" Ender didn't answer. "None of them failed at this point in their course, Ender. You made a mistake with Petra. She'll recover. But Petra is Petra, and you are you. Part of what I am is her, is what she made me. You won't fail, Ender. Not this early in the course. You've had some tight ones, but you've always won. You don't know what your limits are yet. But if you've reached them already, you're a good deal feebler than I thought." "Do they die?" "Who?" "The ones who fail." "No, they don't die." "Good heavens, boy, you're playing games." "I think that Bonzo died. I dreamed about it last night. I remembered the way he looked after I jammed his face with my head. I think I must have pushed his nose back into his brain. The blood was coming out of his eyes. I think he was dead right then. It was just a dream." "Mazer, I don't want to keep dreaming these things. I'm afraid to sleep. I keep thinking of things that I don't want to remember. My whole life keeps playing out as if I were a recorder and someone else wanted to watch the most terrible parts of my life." "We can't drug you if that's what you're hoping for. I'm sorry if you have bad dreams. Should we leave the light on at night?" "Don't make fun of me," Ender said. "I'm afraid I'm going crazy." The doctor was finished with the bandage. Mazer told him he could go. He went. "Are you really afraid of that?" Mazer asked. Ender thought about it and wasn't sure. "In my dreams," said Ender, "I'm never sure whether I'm really me." "Strange dreams are a safety valve, Ender. I'm putting you under a little pressure for the first time in your life. Your body is finding ways to compensate, that's all. You're a big boy now. It's time to stop being afraid of the night." He decided then that he would never tell Mazer about his dreams again. The days wore on, with battles every day, until at last Ender settled into the routine of the destruction of himself. He began to have pains in his stomach. They put him on a bland diet, but soon he didn't have an appetite for anything at all. "Eat," Mazer said, and Ender would mechanically put food in his mouth. But if nobody told him to eat, he didn't eat. 2 more of his squadron leaders collapsed the way that Petra had. The pressure on the rest became all the greater. The enemy outnumbered them by 3 or 4 to 1 in every battle now. The enemy also retreated more readily when things went badly, regrouping to keep the battle going longer and longer. Sometimes battles lasted for hours before they finally destroyed the last enemy ship. Ender began rotating his squadron leaders within the same battle, bringing in fresh and rested ones to take the place of those who were beginning to get sluggish. "You know," said Bean one time as he took over command of Hot Soup's 4 remaining fighters, "this game isn't quite as fun as it used to be." Then one day in practice, as Ender was drilling his squadron leaders, the room went black, and he woke up on the floor with his face bloody where he had hit the controls. They put him to bed then, and for 3 days he was very ill. He remembered seeing faces in his dreams, but they weren't real faces, and he knew it even while he thought he saw them. He thought he saw Valentine sometimes, and sometimes Peter, sometimes his friends from the battle school, and sometimes the buggers vivisecting him. Once it seemed very real when he saw Colonel Graff bending over him, speaking softly to him like a kind father. But then he woke up and found only his enemy, Mazer Rackham. "I'm awake," said Ender. "So I see," Mazer answered. "Took you long enough." "You have a battle today." So Ender got up and fought the battle and won it. But there was no second battle that day, and they let him go to bed earlier. His hands were shaking as he undressed. During the night he thought he felt hands touching him gently, hands with affection in them and gentleness. He dreamed he heard voices. "You haven't been kind to him. That wasn't the assignment. How long can he go on? He's breaking down. Long enough, it's nearly finished. So soon? A few days and then he's through. How will he do when he's already like this? Fine. Even today, he fought better than ever." In his dream, the voices sounded like Colonel Graff and Mazer Rackham. But that was the way dreams were. The craziest things could happen because he dreamed he heard one of the voices saying, "I can't bear to see what this is doing to him." And the other voice answered, "I know. I love him too." And then they changed into Valentine and a lie. And in his dream they were burying him. Only a hill grew up where they laid his body down, and he dried out and became a home for buggers like the giant was. All dreams. If there was love or pity for him, it was only in his dreams. He woke up and fought another battle and won. Then he went to bed and slept again and dreamed again, and then he woke up and won again and slept again, and he hardly noticed when waking became sleeping, nor did he care. The next day was his last day in command school, though he didn't know it. Mazer Rackham was not in the room with him when he woke up. He showered and dressed and waited for Mazer to come unlock the door. He didn't come. Ender tried the door. It was open. Was it an accident that Mazer had let him free this morning? No one with him to tell him he must eat, he must go to practice, he must sleep. Freedom! The trouble was he didn't know what to do. He thought for a moment that he might find his squadron leaders, talk to them face to face, but he didn't know where they were. They could be 20 kilometers away for all he knew. So after wandering through the tunnels for a little while, he went to the mess hall and ate breakfast near a few Marines who were telling dirty jokes that Ender could not begin to understand. Then he went to the simulator room for practice. Even though he was free, he could not think of anything else to do. Mazer was waiting for him. Ender walked slowly into the room. His step was slightly shuffling, and he felt tired and dull. Mazer frowned. "Are you awake, Ender?" There were other people in the simulator room. Ender wondered why they were there, but didn't bother to ask. It wasn't worth asking. No one would tell him anyway. He walked to the simulator controls and sat down, ready to start. "Ender Wiggin," said Mazer. "Please turn around. Today's game needs a little explanation." Ender turned around. He glanced at the men gathered at the back of the room. Most of them he had never seen before. Some were even dressed in civilian clothes. He saw Anderson and wondered what he was doing there, who was taking care of the battle school if he was gone. He saw Graff and remembered the lake in the woods outside Greensboro and wanted to go home. "Take me home," he said silently to Graff. "In my dream you said you loved me. Take me home." But Graff only nodded to him, a greeting, not a promise, and Anderson acted as though he didn't know him at all. "Pay attention, please, Ender. Today is your final examination in command school. These observers are here to evaluate what you have learned. If you prefer not to have them in the room, we'll have them watch on another simulator. They can stay. Final examination. After today, perhaps he could rest. For this to be a fair test of your ability, not just to do what you have practiced many times, but also to meet challenges you have never seen before, today's battle introduces a new element. It is staged around a planet. This will affect the enemy's strategy and will force you to improvise. Please concentrate on the game today. Ender beckoned Mazer closer and asked him quietly, "Am I the first student to make it this far?" "If you win today, Ender, you will be the first student to do so. More than that, I am not at liberty to say." "Well, I am at liberty to hear it." "You can be as petulant as you want tomorrow. Today, though, I'd appreciate it if you would keep your mind on the examination. Let's not waste all that you've already done. Now, how will you deal with the planet?" "I have to get someone behind it, or it's a blind spot." "True. And the gravity is going to affect fuel levels, cheaper to go down than up." "Yes." "Does the little doctor work against the planet?" Mazer's face went rigid. "Ender, the buggers never deliberately attacked a civilian population in either invasion. You decide whether it would be wise to adopt a strategy that would invite reprisals. Is the planet the only new thing? Can you remember the last time I've given you a battle with only one new thing? Let me assure you, Ender, that I will not be kind to you today. I have a responsibility to the fleet not to let a second-rate student graduate. I will do my best against you, Ender, and I have no desire to coddle you. Just keep in mind everything you know about yourself and everything you know about the buggers, and you have a fair chance of amounting to something." Mazer left the room. Ender spoke into the microphone. "Are you there?" "All of us," said Bean. "Kind of late for practice this morning, aren't you?" So they hadn't told the squadron leaders. Ender toyed with the idea of telling them how important this battle was to him, but decided it would not help them to have an extraneous concern on their minds. "Sorry," he said, "I overslept." They all laughed. They didn't believe him. He led them through maneuvers, warming up for the battle ahead. It took him longer than usual to clear his mind, to concentrate on command. But soon enough he was up to speed, responding quickly, thinking well. Or at least, he told himself, "I think that I'm thinking well." The simulator field cleared. Ender waited for the game to appear. What will happen if I pass the test today? Is there another school, another year or two of grueling training, another year of isolation, another year of people pushing me this way and that way, another year without any control over my own life? He tried to remember how old he was. 11. How many years ago did he turn 11? How many days? It must have happened here at the command school, but he couldn't remember the day. Maybe he didn't even notice it at the time. Nobody noticed it, except perhaps Valentine. And as he waited for the game to appear, he wished he could simply lose it. Lose the battle badly and completely so that they would remove him from training like Bonzo and let him go home. Bonzo had been assigned to Cartagena. He wanted to see travel orders that said Greensboro. Success meant it would go on. Failure meant he could go home. No, that isn't true, he told himself. They need me, and if I fail, there might not be any home to return to. But he did not believe it. In his conscious mind he knew it was true, but in other places, deeper places, he doubted that they needed him. Mazer's urgency was just another trick, just another way to make me do what they want me to do, another way to keep me from resting, from doing nothing for a long, long time. Then the enemy formation appeared, and Ender's weariness turned to despair. The enemy outnumbered him 1,000 to 1. The simulator glowed green with them. They were grouped in a dozen different formations, shifting positions, changing shapes, moving in seemingly random patterns through the simulator field. He could not find a path through them. A space that seemed to open would close suddenly, and another appear, and a formation that seemed penetrable would suddenly change and be forbidding. The planet was at the far edge of the field, and for all Ender knew, there were just as many enemy ships beyond it, out of the simulator's range. As for his own fleet, it consisted of 20 starships, each with only 4 fighters. He knew the 4 fighter starships. They were old-fashioned, sluggish, and the range of their little doctors was half that of the newer ones. 80 fighters against at least 5,000, perhaps 10,000 enemy ships. He heard his squadron leaders breathing heavily. He could also hear from the observers behind him a quiet curse. It was nice to know that one of the adults noticed that it wasn't a fair test. Not that it made any difference. Fairness wasn't part of the game. That was plain. There was no attempt to give him even a remote chance at success. All that I've been through, and they never meant to let me pass at all. He saw in his mind Bonzo and his vicious little knot of friends confronting him, threatening him. He had been able to shame Bonzo into fighting him alone. That would hardly work here. And he could not surprise the enemy with his ability as he had done with the older boys in the battle room. Mazer knew Ender's abilities inside and out. The observers behind him began to cough, to move nervously. They were beginning to realize that Ender didn't know what to do. I don't care anymore, thought Ender. You can keep your game. If you won't even give me a chance, why should I play? Like his last game in battle school when they put 2 armies against him. And just as he remembered that game, apparently Bean remembered it too, for his voice came over the headset saying, "Remember, the enemy's gate is down." Molo, Soup, Vlad, Dumper, and Crazy Tom all laughed. They remembered too. And Ender also laughed. It was funny. The adults taking all this so seriously and the children playing along, believing it too, until suddenly the adults went too far, tried too hard, and the children could see through their game. Forget it, Mazer. I don't care if I pass your test. I don't care if I follow your rules. If you can cheat, so can I. I won't let you beat me unfairly. I'll beat you unfairly first. In that final battle in battle school, he had won by ignoring the enemy, ignoring his own losses. He had moved against the enemy's gate. And the enemy's gate was down. If I break this rule, they'll never let me be a commander. It would be too dangerous. I'll never have to play a game again. And that is victory. He whispered quickly into the microphone. His commanders took their parts of the fleet and grouped themselves into a thick projectile. A cylinder aimed at the nearest of the enemy formations. The enemy, far from trying to repel him, welcomed him in, so he could be thoroughly entrapped before they destroyed him. Mazer is at least taking into account the fact that by now they would have learned to respect me, thought Ender, and that does buy me time. Ender dodged downward, north, east, and down again, not seeming to follow any plan, but always ending up a little closer to the enemy planet. Finally, the enemy began to close in on him too tightly. Then, suddenly, Ender's formation burst. His fleet seemed to melt into chaos. The 80 fighters seemed to follow no plan at all, firing at enemy ships at random, working their way into hopeless individual paths among the bugger craft. After a few minutes of battle, however, Ender whispered to his squadron leaders once more, and suddenly a dozen of the remaining fighters formed again into a formation. But now they were on the far side of one of the enemy's most formidable groups. They had, with terrible losses, passed through, and now they had covered more than half the distance to the enemy's planet. The enemy sees now, thought Ender. Surely Mazer sees what I'm doing. Or perhaps Mazer cannot believe that I would do it. Well, so much the better for me. Ender's tiny fleet darted this way and that, sending 2 or 3 fighters out as if to attack, then bringing them back. The enemy closed in, drawing in ships and formations that had been widely scattered, bringing them in for the kill. The enemy was most concentrated beyond Ender, so he could not escape back into open space, closing him in. Excellent, thought Ender. Closer. Come closer. Then he whispered a command, and the ships dropped like rocks toward the planet's surface. They were starships and fighters, completely unequipped to handle the heat of passage through an atmosphere, but Ender never intended them to reach the atmosphere. Almost from the moment they began to drop, they were focusing their little doctors on one thing only: the planet itself. 1, 2, 4, 7 of his fighters were blown away. It was all a gamble now whether any of his ships would survive long enough to get in range. It would not take long once they could focus on the planet's surface. Just a moment with Dr. Device, that's all I want. It occurred to Ender that perhaps the computer wasn't even equipped to show what would happen to a planet if the little doctor attacked it. What will I do then? Shout, "Bang, you're dead"? Ender took his hands off the controls and leaned in to watch what happened. The perspective was close to the enemy planet now, as the ship hurtled into its well of gravity. Surely it's in range now, thought Ender. It must be in range, and the computer can't handle it. Then, the surface of the planet, which filled half the simulator field now, began to bubble. There was a gout of explosion, hurling debris out toward Ender's fighters. Ender tried to imagine what was happening inside the planet, the field growing and growing, the molecules bursting apart but finding nowhere for the separate atoms to go. Within 3 seconds, the entire planet burst apart, becoming a sphere of bright dust hurtling outward. Ender's fighters were among the first to go. Their perspective suddenly vanished, and now the simulator could only display the perspective of the starships waiting beyond the edges of the battle. It was as close as Ender wanted to be. The sphere of the exploding planet grew outward faster than the enemy ships could avoid it, and it carried with it the little doctor, not so little any more, the field taking apart every ship in its path, erupting each one into a dot of light before it went on. Only at the very periphery of the simulator did the MD field weaken. 2 or 3 enemy ships were drifting away. Ender's own starships did not explode, but where the vast enemy fleet had been, and the planet they protected, there was nothing meaningful. A lump of dirt was growing as gravity drew much of the debris downward again. It was glowing hot and spinning visibly. It was also much smaller than the world had been before. Much of its mass was now a cloud still flowing outward. Ender took off his headphones, filled with the cheers of his squadron leaders, and only then realized that there was just as much noise in the room with him. Men in uniform were hugging each other, laughing, shouting. Others were weeping. Some knelt or lay prostrate, and Ender knew they were caught up in prayer. Ender didn't understand. It seemed all wrong. They were supposed to be angry. Colonel Graff detached himself from the others and came to Ender. Tears streamed down his face, but he was smiling. He bent over, reached out his arms, and to Ender's surprise he embraced him, held him tightly, and whispered, "Thank you. Thank you, Ender. Thank God for you, Ender." And others soon came too, shaking his hand, congratulating him. He tried to make sense of this. Had he passed the test after all? It was his victory, not theirs, and a hollow one at that, a cheat. Why did they act as if he had won with honor? The crowd parted, and Mazer Rackham walked through. He came straight to Ender and held out his hand. "You made the hard choice, boy. All or nothing. End them or end us. But heaven knows there was no other way you could have done it. Congratulations. You beat them, and it's all over." All over. Beat them. Ender didn't understand. "I beat you." Mazer laughed, a loud laugh that filled the room. "Ender, you never played me. You never played a game since I became your enemy." Ender didn't get the joke. He had played a great many games, at a terrible cost to himself. He began to get angry. Mazer reached out and touched his shoulder. Ender shrugged him off. Mazer then grew serious and said, "Ender, for the past few months you have been the battle commander of our fleets. This was the third invasion. There were no games. The battles were real, and the only enemy you fought was the buggers. You won every battle, and today you finally fought them at their home world, where the Queen was. All the queens from all their colonies, they all were there, and you destroyed them completely. They'll never attack us again. You did it. You. Real. Not a game." Ender's mind was too tired to cope with it all. They weren't just points of light in the air. They were real ships that he had fought with and real ships he had destroyed, and a real world that he had blasted into oblivion. He walked through the crowd, dodging their congratulations, ignoring their hands, their words, their rejoicing. When he got to his own room, he stripped off his clothes, climbed into bed, and slept. Ender awoke when they shook him. It took a moment to recognize them, Graf and Rackham. He turned his back on them. "Let me sleep." "Ender, we need to talk to you," said Graf. Ender rolled back to face them. "They've been playing out the videos on Earth all day, all night since the battle yesterday." Yesterday? He had slept through until the next day. "You're a hero, Ender. They've seen what you did, you and the others. I don't think there's a government on Earth that hasn't voted you their highest medal." "I killed them all, didn't I?" Ender asked. "All who?" asked Graf. "The buggers?" "That was the idea." Mazer leaned in close. "That's what the war was for." "All their queens. So I killed all their children, all of everything." "They decided that when they attacked us. It wasn't your fault. It's what had to happen." Ender grabbed Mazer's uniform and hung onto it, pulling him down so they were face to face. "I didn't want to kill them all. I didn't want to kill anybody. I'm not a killer. You didn't want me, you bastards. You wanted Peter. But you made me do it. You tricked me into it." He was crying. He was out of control. "Of course we tricked you into it. That's the whole point," said Graf. "It had to be a trick or you couldn't have done it. It's the bind we were in. We had to have a commander with so much empathy that he would think like the buggers, understand them, and anticipate them. So much compassion that he could win the love of his underlings and work with them like a perfect machine, as perfect as the buggers. But somebody with that much compassion could never be the killer we needed, could never go into battle willing to win at all costs. If you knew, you couldn't do it. If you were the kind of person who would do it even if you knew, you could never have understood the buggers well enough." "And it had to be a child, Ender," said Mazer. "You were faster than me, better than me. I was too old and cautious. Any decent person who knows what warfare is can never go into battle with a whole heart. But you didn't know. We made sure you didn't know. You were reckless and brilliant and young. It's what you were born for." "We had pilots with our ships, didn't we?" "Yes. I was ordering pilots to go in and die, and I didn't even know it. They knew it, Ender. And they went anyway. They knew what it was for. You never asked me. You never told me the truth about anything. You had to be a weapon, Ender, like a gun, like the little doctor, functioning perfectly but not knowing what you were aimed at. We aimed you. We're responsible. If there was something wrong, we did it." "Tell me later," Ender said. His eyes closed. Mazer Rackham shook him. "Don't go to sleep, Ender," he said. "It's very important." "You're finished with me," Ender said. "Now leave me alone." "That's why we're here," Mazer said. "We're trying to tell you. They're not through with you, not at all. It's crazy down there. They're going to start a war. Americans claiming the Warsaw Pact is about to attack, and the Russians are saying the same thing about the hegemon. The bugger war isn't 24 hours dead, and the world down there is back to fighting again as bad as ever. And all of them are worried about you. All of them want you. The greatest military leader in history, they want you to lead their armies. The Americans, the hegemon, everybody but the Warsaw Pact, and they want you dead. Fine with me, said Ender. We have to take you away from here. There are Russian Marines all over Eros, and the Polemark is Russian. It could turn to bloodshed at any time. Ender turned his back on them again. This time they let him. He did not sleep, though. He listened to them. I was afraid of this, Rackham. You pushed him too hard. Some of those lesser outposts could have waited until after. You could have given him some days to rest. Are you doing it too, Graf? Trying to decide how I could have done it better? You don't know what would have happened if I hadn't pushed. Nobody knows. I did it the way I did it, and it worked. Above all, it worked. Memorize that defense, Graf. You may have to use it too. Sorry. I can see what it's done to him. Colonel Leakey says there's a good chance he'll be permanently damaged, but I don't believe it. He's too strong. Winning meant a lot to him, and he won. Don't tell me about strong. The kid's 11. Give him some rest, Rackham. Things haven't exploded yet. We can post a guard outside his door. Or post a guard outside another door and pretend that it's his. Whatever. They went away. Ender slept again. Time passed without touching Ender except with glancing blows. Once he awoke for a few minutes with something pressing his hand, pushing downward on it with a dull, insistent pain. He reached over and touched it. It was a needle passing into a vein. He tried to pull it out, but it was taped on and he was too weak. Another time he awoke in darkness to hear people near him murmuring and cursing. His ears were ringing with the loud noise that had awakened him. He did not remember the noise. "Get the lights on," someone said. And another time he thought he heard someone crying softly near him. It might have been a single day. It might have been a week. From his dreams, it could have been months. He seemed to pass through lifetimes in his dreams, through the giant's drink again, past the wolf children, reliving the terrible deaths, the constant murders. He heard a voice whispering in the forest, "You had to kill the children to get to the end of the world." And he tried to answer, "I never wanted to kill anybody. Nobody ever asked me if I wanted to kill anybody." But the forest laughed at him. And when he leapt from the cliff at the end of the world, sometimes it was not clouds that caught him, but a fighter that carried him to a vantage point near the surface of the bugger's world, so he could watch over and over the eruption of death when Dr. Device set off a reaction on the planet's face. Then closer and closer until he could watch individual buggers explode, turn to light, then collapse into a pile of dirt before his eyes. And the Queen, surrounded by infants, only the Queen was mother, and the infants were Valentine and all the children he had known in battle school. One of them had Bonzo's face, and he lay there bleeding through the eyes and nose, saying, "You have no honor." And always the dream ended with a mirror, or a pool of water, or the metal surface of a ship, something that would reflect his face back to him. At first it was always Peter's face, with blood and a snake's tail coming from the mouth. After a while, though, it began to be his own face, old and sad, with eyes that grieved for a billion murders. But they were his own eyes, and he was content to wear them. That was the world Ender lived in for many lifetimes during the 5 days of the League War. When he awoke again, he was lying in darkness. In the distance, he could hear the thump of explosions. He listened for a while, then he heard a soft footstep. He turned over and flung out a hand to grasp whoever was sneaking up on him. Sure enough, he caught someone's clothing and pulled him down toward his knees, ready to kill him if need be. "Ender, it's me." He knew the voice. It came out of his memory as if it were 1,000,000 years ago. A lie. "Salam, pinprick. What were you trying to do, kill me?" "Yes. I thought you were trying to kill me. I was trying not to wake you up. Well, at least you have some survival instinct left. The way Mazer talks about it, you were becoming a vegetable. I was trying to. What's the thumping? There's a war going on here. Our section is blacked out to keep us safe. Ender swung his legs out to sit up. He couldn't do it, though. His head hurt too bad. He winced in pain. Don't sit up, Ender. It's all right. It looks like we might win it. Not all the Warsaw Pact people went with the Polomark. A lot of them came over when the Strategos told them you were loyal to the IF. I was asleep. So he lied. You weren't plotting treason in your dreams, were you? Some of the Russians who came in told us that when the Polomark ordered them to find you and kill you, they almost killed him. Whatever they may feel about other people, Ender, they love you. The whole world watched our battles, videos, day and night. I've seen some, complete with your voice giving the orders. It's all there, nothing censored. Good stuff. You've got a career in the vids. I don't think so, said Ender. I was joking. Hey, can you believe it? We won the war. We were so eager to grow up so we could fight in it, and it was us all the time. I mean, we're kids, Ender, and it was us. Alai laughed. It was you, anyway. You were good, Bosch. I didn't know how you'd get us out of that last one, but you did. You were good. Ender noticed the way he spoke in the past. I was good. What am I now, Alai? Still good. At what? At anything. There's 1,000,000 soldiers who'd follow you to the end of the universe. I don't want to go to the end of the universe. So where do you want to go? They'll follow you. I want to go home, thought Ender, but I don't know where it is. The thumping went silent. Listen to that, said Alai. They listened. The door opened. Someone stood there, someone small. It's over, he said. It was Bean. As if to prove it, the lights went on. Ho, Bean. Ho, Ender. Petra followed him in, with Dink holding her hand. They came to Ender's bed. Hey, the hero's awake, said Dink. Who won, said Ender. We did, Ender, said Bean. You were there. He's not that crazy, Bean. He meant who won just now. Petra took Ender's hand. There was a truce on Earth. They've been negotiating for days. They finally agreed to accept the Locke proposal. He doesn't know about the Locke proposal. It's very complicated, but what it means here is that the IF will stay in existence, but without the Warsaw Pact in it. So the Warsaw Pact Marines are going home. I think Russia agreed to it because they're facing a revolt in the Islamic States. Everybody's got troubles. About 500 died here, but it was worse on Earth. The hegemon resigned, said Dink. It's crazy down there. Who cares? You okay? Petra asked him, touching his head. You scared us. They said you were crazy, and we said they were crazy. Oh, I'm crazy, said Ender. But I think I'm okay. When did you decide that? Asked Alai. When I thought you were about to kill me, and I decided to kill you first. I guess I'm just a killer to the core. But I'd rather be alive than dead. They laughed and agreed with him. Then Ender began to cry and embraced Bean and Petra, who were closest. I missed you, he said. I wanted to see you so bad. You saw us pretty bad, Petra answered. She kissed his cheek. I saw you magnificent, said Ender. The ones I needed most, I used up soonest. Bad planning on my part. Everybody's okay now, said Dink. Nothing was wrong with any of us that 5 days of cowering in blacked-out rooms in the middle of a war couldn't cure. I don't have to be your commander anymore, do I? Asked Ender. I don't want to command anybody again. You don't have to command anybody, said Dink, but you're always our commander. Then they were silent for a while. So what do we do now? Asked Alai. The bugger war's over, and so's the war down there on Earth, and even the war here. What do we do now? We're kids, said Petra. They'll probably make us go to school. It's a law. You have to go to school until you're 17. They all laughed at that. Laughed until tears streamed down their faces.
The lake was still. There was no breeze. The two men sat together in chairs on the floating dock. A small wooden raft was tied up at the dock. Graf hooked his foot in the rope and pulled the raft in, then let it drift out, then pulled it in again. You've lost weight. One kind of stress puts it on, another takes it off. I'm a creature of chemicals. It must have been hard. Graf shrugged. Not really. I knew I'd be acquitted. Some of us weren't so sure. People were crazy for a while there. Mistreatment of children, negligent homicide. Those videos of Bonzo's and Stilson's deaths were pretty gruesome. To watch one child do that to another. As much as anything, I think the videos saved me. The prosecution edited them, but we showed the whole thing. It was plain that Ender was not the provocateur. After that, it was just a second-guessing game. I said I did what I believed was necessary for the preservation of the human race, and it worked. We got the judges to agree that the prosecution had to prove beyond doubt that Ender would have won the war without the training we gave him. After that, it was simple. The exigencies of war. Anyway, Graf, it was a great relief to us. I know we quarreled, and I know the prosecution used tapes of our conversations against you, but by then I knew you were right, and I offered to testify for you. I know, Anderson. My lawyers told me. So what will you do now? I don't know. I'm still relaxing. I have a few years of leave accrued, enough to take me to retirement, and I have plenty of salary that I never used, sitting around in banks. I could live on the interest. Maybe I'll do nothing. It sounds nice, but I couldn't stand it. I've been offered the presidency of 3 different universities, on the theory that I'm an educator. They don't believe me when I say that all I ever cared about at the battle school was the game. I think I'll go with the other offer. Commissioner, now that the wars are over, it's time to play games again. It'll be almost like vacation anyway. Only 28 teams in the league. Though after years of watching those children flying, football is like watching slugs bash into each other. They laughed. Graf sighed and pushed the raft with his foot. That raft, surely you can't float on it. Graf shook his head. Ender built it. That's right. This is where you took him. It's even been deeded over to him. I saw to it that he was amply rewarded. He'll have all the money he ever needs. If they ever let him come back to use it. They never will. With Demosthenes agitating for him to come home, Demosthenes isn't on the nets anymore. Anderson raised an eyebrow. What does that mean? Demosthenes has retired. Permanently. You know something, you old fart-eater. You know who Demosthenes is. Was. Well, tell me. No. You're no fun anymore, Graf. I never was. At least you can tell me why. There were a lot of us who thought Demosthenes would be hegemon someday. There was never a chance of that. No. Even Demosthenes' mob of political cretins couldn't persuade the hegemon to bring Ender back to Earth. Ender is far too dangerous. He's only 11, 12 now. All the more dangerous, because he could so easily be controlled. In all the world, the name of Ender is one to conjure with. The child god, the miracle worker, with life and death in his hands. Every petty tyrant-to-be would like to have the boy, to set him in front of an army and watch the world either flock to join or cower in fear. If Ender came to Earth, he'd want to come here, to rest, to salvage what he can of his childhood. But they'd never let him rest. I see. Someone explained that to Demosthenes. Graf smiled. Demosthenes explained it to someone else. Someone who could have used Ender as no one else could have, to rule the world and make the world like it. Who? Locke. Locke is the one who argued for Ender to stay on Eros. All is not always as it seems. It's too deep for me, Graf. Give me the game. Nice, Neat rules. Referees, beginnings and endings, winners and losers, and then everybody goes home to their families. Get me tickets to some games now and then, all right? You won't really stay here and retire, will you? No. You're going into the hegemony, aren't you? I'm the new Minister of Colonization. So they're doing it. As soon as we get the reports back on the bugger colony worlds. I mean, there they are, already fertile, with housing and industry in place, and all the buggers dead. Very convenient. We'll repeal the population limitation laws, which everybody hates, and all those thirds and fourths and fifths will get on starships and head out for worlds known and unknown. Will people really go? People always go. Always. They always believe they can make a better life than in the old world. What the hell? Maybe they can.
At first, Ender believed that they would bring him back to Earth as soon as things quieted down. But things were quiet now, had been quiet for a year, and it was plain to him now that they would not bring him back at all, that he was much more useful as a name and a story than he would ever be as an inconvenient flesh-and-blood person. And there was the matter of the court-martial and the crimes of Colonel Graff. Admiral Shamrajnagar tried to keep Ender from watching it, but failed. Ender had been awarded the rank of admiral too, and this was one of the few times he asserted the privileges the rank implied. So he watched the videos of the fights with Stilson and Bonzo, watched as the photographs of the corpses were displayed, listened as the psychologists and lawyers argued whether murder had been committed or the killing was in self-defense. Ender had his own opinion, but no one asked him. Throughout the trial, it was really Ender himself under attack. The prosecution was too clever to charge him directly, but there were attempts to make him look sick, perverted, criminally insane. "Never mind," said Mazer Rackham. "The politicians are afraid of you, but they can't destroy your reputation yet. That won't be done until the historians get at you in 30 years. Ender didn't care about his reputation. He watched the videos impassively, but in fact he was amused. "In battle I killed 10 billion buggers, whose queens at least were as alive and wise as any man, who had not even launched a third attack against us, and no one thinks to call it a crime." All his crimes weighed heavy on him, the deaths of Stilson and Bonzo, no heavier and no lighter than the rest. And so with that burden he waited through the empty months until the world that he had saved decided he could come home. One by one, his friends reluctantly left him, called home to their families to be received with heroes' welcomes in hometowns they barely remembered. Ender watched the videos of their homecomings and was touched when they spent much of their time praising Ender Wiggin, who taught them everything, they said, who taught them and led them into victory. But if they called for him to be brought home, the words were censored from the videos, and no one heard the plea. For a time, the only work in Eros was cleaning up after the Bloody League War and receiving the reports of the starships, once warships, that were now exploring the bugger colony worlds. But now Eros was busier than ever, more crowded than it had ever been during the war, as colonists were brought here to prepare for their voyages to the empty bugger worlds. Ender took part in the work as much as they would let him. It did not occur to them that this 12-year-old boy might be as gifted at peace as he was at war. But he was patient with their tendency to ignore him, and learned to make his proposals and suggest his plans through the few adults who listened to him, and let them present them as their own. He was concerned not about getting credit, but about getting the job done. The one thing he could not bear was the worship of the colonists. He learned to avoid the tunnels where they lived because they would always recognize him. The world had memorized his face. And then they would scream and shout and embrace him and congratulate him and show him the children they had named after him and tell him how he was so young it broke their hearts, and they didn't blame him for any of his murders because it wasn't his fault, he was just a child. He hid from them as best he could. There was one colonist, though, he couldn't hide from. He wasn't inside Eros that day. he had gone up with the shuttle to the new ISL, where he had been learning to do surface work on the starships. It was unbecoming to an officer to do mechanical labor, Shamrajnagar told him, but Ender answered that since the trade he had mastered wasn't much called for now, it was about time he learned another skill. They spoke to him through his helmet radio and told him that someone was waiting to see him as soon as he could come in. Ender couldn't think of anyone he wanted to see, and so he didn't hurry. He finished installing the shield for the ship's ansible, and then hooked his way across the face of the ship and pulled himself up into the airlock. She was waiting for him outside the changing room. For a moment he was annoyed that they would let a colonist come to bother him here, where he came to be alone. Then he looked again and realized that if the young woman were a little girl, he would know her. "Valentine," he said.
"Hi, Ender."
"What are you doing here?"
"Demosthenes retired. Now I'm going with the first colony."
"It's 50 years to get there."
"Only 2 years, if you're aboard the ship."
"And if you ever came back, everybody you knew on Earth would be dead."
"That was what I had in mind. I was hoping, though, that someone I knew on Eros might come with me."
"I don't want to go to a world we stole from the buggers. I just want to go home."
"Ender, you're never going back to Earth. I saw to that before I left."
He looked at her in silence.
"I tell you that now so that if you want to hate me, you can hate me from the beginning."
They went to Ender's tiny compartment in the ISL, and she explained. Peter wanted Ender back on Earth under the protection of the Hegemon's Council.
"The way things are right now, Ender, that would put you effectively under Peter's control, since half the Council now does just what Peter wants. The ones that aren't Locke's lapdogs are under his thumb in other ways."
"Do they know who he really is?"
"Yes. He isn't publicly known, but people in high places know him. It doesn't matter anymore. He has too much power for them to worry about his age. He's done incredible things, Ender."
"I noticed the treaty a year ago was named for Locke."
"That was his breakthrough. He proposed it through his friends from the public policy nets, and then Demosthenes got behind it too. It was the moment he had been waiting for, to use Demosthenes' influence with the mob and Locke's influence with the intelligentsia to accomplish something noteworthy. It forestalled a really vicious war that could have lasted for decades."
"He decided to be a statesman."
"I think so. But in his cynical moments, of which there are many, he pointed out to me that if he had allowed the League to fall apart completely, he'd have to conquer the world piece by piece. As long as the hegemony existed, he could do it in one lump."
Ender nodded. "That's the Peter that I knew."
Funny, isn't it? That Peter would save millions of lives.
"While I killed billions."
I wasn't going to say that.
"So he wanted to use me?"
He had plans for you, Ender. He would publicly reveal himself when you arrived, going to meet you in front of all the videos. Ender Wiggin's older brother, who also happened to be the great Locke, the architect of peace. Standing next to you, he would look quite mature. And the physical resemblance between you is stronger than ever. It would be quite simple for him, then, to take over."
"Why did you stop him?"
"Ender, you wouldn't be happy spending the rest of your life as Peter's pawn."
"Why not? I've spent my life as someone's pawn."
"Me too. I showed Peter all the evidence that I had assembled, enough to prove in the eyes of the public that he was a psychotic killer. It included full-color pictures of tortured squirrels and some of the monitor videos of the way he treated you. It took some work to get it all together, but by the time he saw it, he was willing to give me what I wanted. What I wanted was your freedom and mine."
"It's not my idea of freedom to go live in the house of the people that I killed."
"Ender, what's done is done. Their worlds are empty now, and ours is full. And we can take with us what their worlds have never known. Cities full of people who live private, individual lives, who love and hate each other for their own reasons. In all the bugger worlds, there was never more than a single story to be told. When we're there, the world will be full of stories, and will improvise their endings day by day. Ender Earth belongs to Peter, and if you don't go with me now, he'll have you there, and use you up until you wish you'd never been born. Now is the only chance you'll get to get away.
Ender said nothing.
I know what you're thinking, Ender. You're thinking that I'm trying to control you just as much as Peter or Graf or any of the others.
It crossed my mind.
Welcome to the human race. Nobody controls his own life, Ender. The best you can do is choose to fill the roles given you by good people, by people who love you. I didn't come here because I wanted to be a colonist. I came here because I've spent my whole life in the company of the brother that I hated. Now I want a chance to know the brother that I love, before it's too late, before we're not children anymore.
It's already too late for that.
You're wrong, Ender. You think you're grown up and tired and jaded with everything, but in your heart, you're just as much a kid as I am. We can keep it a secret from everybody else. While you're governing the colony and I'm writing political philosophy, they'll never guess that in the darkness of night we sneak into each other's rooms and play checkers and have pillow fights.
Ender laughed. But he had noticed some things she dropped too casually for them to be accidental. Governing?
I'm Demosthenes, Ender. I went out with a bang. A public announcement that I believed so much in the colonization movement that I was going in the first ship myself. At the same time, the Minister of Colonization, a former colonel named Graf, announced that the pilot of the colony ship would be the great Mazer Rackham, and the governor of the first colony it established would be Ender Wiggin.
They might have asked me.
I wanted to ask you myself.
But it's already announced.
No, they'll be announcing it tomorrow, if you accept. Mazer accepted a few hours ago, back in Eros.
You're telling everyone that you're Demosthenes? A 14-year-old girl?
We're only telling them that Demosthenes is going with the colony. Let them spend the next 50 years poring over the passenger list, trying to figure out which one of them is the great demagogue of the age of Locke.
Ender laughed and shook his head. You're actually having fun, Val.
I can't think why I shouldn't.
All right, said Ender. I'll go. Maybe even as governor, as long as you and Mazer are there to help me. My abilities are a little underused at present.
She squealed and hugged him, for all the world like a typical teenage girl who just got the present that she wanted from her little brother.
Val, he said, I just want one thing clear. I'm not going for you. I'm not going in order to be governor or because I'm bored here. I'm going because I know the buggers better than any other living soul, and maybe if I go there, I can understand them better. I stole their future from them. I can only begin to repay by seeing what I can learn from their past.
The voyage was long. By the end of it, Val had finished the first volume of her history of the Bugger Wars and transmitted it by Ansible, under Demosthenes' name, back to Earth. And Ender had won something better than the adulation of the passengers. They knew him now, and he had won their love and their respect. He worked hard on the new world. He quickly understood the differences between military and civilian leadership, and governed by persuasion rather than fiat, and by working as hard as anyone at the tasks involved in setting up a self-sustaining economy. But his most important work, as everyone agreed, was exploring what the buggers had left behind, trying to find among structures, machinery, and fields long untended, some things that human beings could use, could learn from. There were no books to read. The buggers never needed them. With all things present in their memories, all things spoken as they were thought, when the buggers died, their knowledge died with them. And yet, from the sturdiness of the roofs that covered their animal sheds and their food supplies, Ender learned that winter would be hard with heavy snows. From fences with sharpened stakes that pointed outward, he learned that there were marauding animals that were a danger to the crops or the herds. From the mill, he learned that the long, foul-tasting fruits that grew in the overgrown orchards were dried and ground into meal. And from the slings that once were used to carry infants along with adults into the fields, he learned that even though the buggers were not much for individuality, they did care for their young. Life settled down, and years passed. The colony lived in wooden houses and used the tunnels of the bugger city for storage and manufactories. They were governed by a council now, and administrators were elected, so that Ender, though they still called him governor, was in fact only a judge. There were crimes and quarrels, alongside kindness and cooperation. There were people who loved each other and people who did not. It was a human world. They did not wait so eagerly for each new transmission from the Ansible. The names that were famous on earth meant little to them now. The only name they knew was that of Peter Wiggin, the hegemon of Earth. The only news that came was news of peace, of prosperity, of great ships leaving the littoral of Earth's solar system, passing the comet shield, and filling up the bugger worlds. Soon there would be other colonies on this world, Ender's world. Soon there would be neighbors. Already they were halfway here. But no one cared. They would help the newcomers when they came, teach them what they had learned. But what mattered in life now was who would marry whom, and who was sick, and when was planting time, and why should I pay him when the calf died 3 weeks after I got it? They've become people of the land, said Valentine. No one cares now that Demosthenes is sending the 7th volume of his history today. No one here will read it. Ender pressed a button and his desk showed him the next page. Very insightful, Valentine. How many more volumes until you're through? Just one. The story of Ender Wiggin. What will you do? Wait to write it until I'm dead? No. Just write it, and when I've brought it up to present day, I'll stop. I have a better idea. Take it up to the day we won the final battle. Stop it there. Nothing that I've done since then is worth writing down. Maybe, said Valentine. And maybe not.
The Ansible had brought them word that the new colony ship was only a year away. They asked Ender to find a place for them to settle in, near enough to Ender's colony that the two colonies could trade, but far enough apart that they could be governed separately. Ender used the helicopter and began to explore. He took one of the children along, an 11-year-old boy named Abra. He had been only 3 when the colony was founded, and he remembered no other world than this. He and Ender flew as far away as Ender thought the new colony should be, then camped for the night and got a feel for the land on foot the next morning. It was on the 3rd morning that Ender suddenly began to feel an uneasy sense that he had been in this place before. He looked around. It was new land. He had never seen it. He called out to Abra. "Ho, Ender," Abra called. He was on top of a steep, low hill. "Come up." Ender scrambled up, the turves coming away from his feet in the soft ground. Abra was pointing downward. "Can you believe this?" he asked. The hill was hollow. A deep depression in the middle, partially filled with water, was ringed by concave slopes that cantilevered dangerously over the water. In one direction, the hill gave way to two long ridges that made a V-shaped valley. In the other direction, the hill rose to a piece of white rock, grinning like a skull, with a tree growing out of its mouth. "It's like a giant died here," said Abra, "and the earth grew up to cover his carcass." Now Ender knew why it had looked familiar, the giant's corpse. He had played here too many times as a child not to know this place. But it was not possible. The computer in the battle school could not possibly have seen this place. He looked through his binoculars in a direction he knew well, fearing and hoping that he would see what belonged in that place. Swings and slides. Monkey bars, now overgrown, but the shapes still unmistakable. "Somebody had to have built this," Abra said. "Look, this skull place, it's not rock. Look at it, this is concrete." "I know," said Ender. "They built it for me." "What?" "I know this place, Abra. The buggers built it for me. The buggers were all dead 50 years before we got here." "You're right. It's impossible, but I know what I know. Abra, I shouldn't take you with me. It might be dangerous. If they knew me well enough to build this place, they might be planning to get even with you? For killing them. So don't go, Ender. Don't do what they want you to do." "If they want to get revenge, Abra, I don't mind. But perhaps they don't. Perhaps this is the closest they could come to talking, to writing me a note. They didn't know how to read and write. Maybe they were learning when they died." "Well, I'm sure as hell not sticking around here if you're taking off somewhere. I'm going with you." "No. You're too young to take the risk of—" "Come on! You're Ender Wiggin. Don't tell me what 11-year-old kids can do." Together they flew in the copter, over the playground, over the woods, over the well in the forest clearing. Then out to where there was, indeed, a cliff, with a cave in the cliff wall, and the ledge right where the end of the world should be. And there in the distance, just where it should be in the fantasy game, was the castle tower. He left Abra with the copter. "Don't come after me, and go home in an hour if I don't come back." "Eat it, Ender. I'm coming with you. Eat it yourself, Abra, or I'll stuff you with mud." Abra could tell, despite Ender's joking tone, that he meant it, and so he stayed. The walls of the tower were notched and ledged for easy climbing. They meant him to get in. The room was as it had always been. Ender remembered well enough to look for a snake on the floor, but there was only a rug with a carved snake's head in one corner. Imitation, not duplication. For a people who made no art, they had done well. They must have dragged these images from Ender's own mind, finding him and learning his darkest dreams across the light years. But why? To bring him to this room, of course, to leave a message for him. But where was the message, and how would he understand it? The mirror was waiting for him on the wall. It was a dull sheet of metal in which the rough shape of a human face had been scratched. They tried to draw the image I should see in the picture, and, looking at the mirror, he could remember breaking it, pulling it from the wall, and snakes leaping out of the hidden place, attacking him, biting him wherever their poisonous fangs could find purchase. "How well do they know me?" wondered Ender. "Well enough to know how often I have thought of death, to know that I am not afraid of it. Well enough to know that even if I feared death, it would not stop me from taking that mirror from the wall." He walked to the mirror, lifted, pulled away. Nothing jumped from the space behind it. Instead, in a hollowed-out place, there was a white ball of silk with a few frayed strands sticking out here and there. An egg? No. The pupa of a queen bugger, already fertilized by the larval males, ready, out of her own body, to hatch 100,000 buggers, including a few queens and males. Ender could see in his mind the slug-like males clinging to the walls of a dark tunnel, and the large adults carrying the infant queen to the mating room, Each male in turn penetrated the larval queen, shuddered in ecstasy, and died, dropping to the tunnel floor and shriveling. Then the new queen was laid before the old, a magnificent creature clad in soft and shimmering wings which had long since lost the power of flight but still contained the power of majesty. The old queen kissed her to sleep with the gentle poison in her lips, then wrapped her in threads from her belly, and commanded her to become herself, to become a new city, a new world, to give birth to many queens and many worlds. How do I know this? Thought Ender. How can I see these things like memories in my own mind? As if in answer, he saw the first of all his battles with the bugger fleets. He had seen it before on the simulator. Now he saw it as the hive queens saw it, through many different eyes. The buggers formed their globe of ships, and then the terrible fighters came out of the darkness, and the little doctor destroyed them in a blaze of light. He felt, then, what the hive queen felt, watching through her workers' eyes, as death came to them too quickly to avoid, but not too quickly to be anticipated. There was no memory of pain or fear, though. What the hive queen felt was sadness, a sense of resignation. She had not thought these words as she saw the humans coming to kill, but it was in words that Ender understood her. The humans did not forgive us, she thought. We will surely die. How can you live again? He asked. The queen in her silken cocoon had no words to give back, but when he closed his eyes and tried to remember, instead of memory came new images. Putting the cocoon in a cool place, a dark place, but with water, so she wasn't dry, so that certain reactions could take place in the cocoon. Then time, days and weeks for the pupa inside to change. And then, when the cocoon had changed to a dusty brown color, Ender saw himself splitting open the cocoon and helping the small and fragile queen emerge. He saw himself taking her by the forelimb and helping her walk from her birth water to a nesting place, soft with dried leaves on sand. Then I am alive, came the thought in his mind. Then I am awake. Then I make my 10,000 children. No, said Ender, I can't. Anguish. Your children are the monsters of our nightmares now. If I awoke you, we would only kill you again. There flashed through his mind a dozen images of human beings being killed by buggers, but with the image came a grief so powerful he could not bear it, and he wept their tears for them. If you could make them feel as you can make me feel, then perhaps they could forgive you. Only me, he realized. They found me through the Ansible, followed it, and dwelt in my mind. In the agony of my tortured dreams, they came to know me even as I spent my days destroying them. They found my fear of them, and found also that I had no knowledge I was killing them. In the few weeks they had, they built this place for me, and the giant's corpse, and the ledge at the end of the world, so I would find this place by the evidence of my eyes. I am the only one they know, and so they can only talk to me and through me. We are like you, the thought pressed into his mind. We did not mean to murder, and when we understood, we never came again. We thought we were the only thinking beings in the universe until we met you, but never did we dream that thought could arise from the lonely animals who cannot dream each other's dreams. How were we to know we could live with you in peace? Believe us, believe us, believe us. He reached into the cavity and took out the cocoon. It was astonishingly light, to hold all the hope and future of a great race within it. I'll carry you, said Ender. I'll go from world to world until I find a time and a place where you can come awake in safety. And I'll tell your story to my people, so that perhaps in time they can forgive you too, the way that you've forgiven me. He wrapped the queen's cocoon in his jacket and carried her from the tower. "What was in there?" asked Abra. "The answer," said Ender. "To what?" "My question." And that was all he said of the matter. They searched for 5 more days and chose a site for the colony far to the east and south of the tower. Weeks later, he came to Valentine and told her to read something he had written. She pulled the file he named from the ship's computer and read it. It was written as if the Hive Queen spoke, telling all that they had meant to do and all that they had done. "Here are our failures, and here is our greatness. We did not mean to hurt you, and we forgive you for our death." From their earliest awareness to the great wars that swept across their home world, Ender told the story quickly, as if it were ancient memory. When he came to the tale of the Great Mother, the Queen of all, who first learned to keep and teach the new queen instead of killing her or driving her away, then he lingered, telling how many times she had finally to destroy the child of her body, the new self that was not herself, until she bore one who understood her quest for harmony. This was a new thing in the world. 2 queens that loved and helped each other instead of battling, and together they were stronger than any other hive. They prospered. They had more daughters who joined them in peace. It was the beginning of wisdom. "If only we could have talked to you," the Hive Queen said in Ender's words. "But since it could not be, we ask only this, that you remember us not as enemies, but as tragic sisters, changed into a foul shape by fate or God or evolution. If we had kissed, it would have been the miracle to make us human in each other's eyes. Instead, we killed each other. But still we welcome you now as guest friends. Come into our home, daughters of earth, dwell in our tunnels, harvest our fields. What we cannot do, you are now our hands to do for us. Blossom, trees, ripen, fields. Be warm for them, suns. Be fertile for them, planets. They are our adopted daughters, and they have come home." The book that Ender wrote was not long, but in it was all the good and all the evil that the Hive Queen knew. And he signed it, not with his name, but with a title: Speaker for the Dead. On Earth, the book was published quietly, and quietly it was passed from hand to hand until it was hard to believe that anyone on Earth might not have read it. Most who read it found it interesting. Some who read it refused to set it aside. They began to live by it as best they could, and when their loved ones died, a believer would arise beside the grave to be the speaker for the dead, and say what the dead one would have said, but with full candor, hiding no faults and pretending no virtues. Those who came to such services sometimes found them painful and disturbing, but there were many who decided that their life was worthwhile enough, despite their errors, that when they died, a speaker should tell the truth for them. On Earth it remained a religion among many religions, but for those who traveled the great cave of space and lived their lives in the Hive Queen's tunnels and harvested the Hive Queen's fields, it was the only religion. There was no colony without its speaker for the dead. No one knew and no one really wanted to know who was the original speaker. Ender was not inclined to tell them. When Valentine was 25 years old, she finished the last volume of her History of the Bugger Wars. She included at the end the complete text of Ender's little book, but did not say that Ender wrote it. By Ansible, she got an answer from the ancient hegemon, Peter Wiggin, 77 years old with a failing heart. "I know who wrote it," he said. "If he can speak for the buggers, surely he can speak for me." Back and forth across the Ansible, Ender and Peter spoke, with Peter pouring out the story of his days and years, his crimes and his kindnesses. And when he died, Ender wrote a second volume, again signed by the speaker for the dead. Together, his 2 books were called The Hive Queen and the Hegemon, and they were Holy Writ. "Come on," he said to Valentine one day. "Let's fly away and live forever." "We can't," she said. "There are miracles even relativity can't pull off, Ender. We have to go. I'm almost happy here. So stay." I've lived too long with pain. I won't know who I am without it." So they boarded a starship and went from world to world. Wherever they stopped, he was always Andrew Wiggin, itinerant speaker for the dead, and she was always Valentine, historian errant, writing down the stories of the living, while Ender spoke the stories of the dead. And always Ender carried with him a dry, white cocoon, looking for the world where the hive queen could awaken and thrive in peace. He looked a long time.
A postscript. Orson Scott Card.
So, it's been 20 years since Ender's Game was first published as a hardcover novel. Of course, for me, it's been a lot longer than that. It was a short story, originally, a novelette, according to the technical definition, that came out in the August 1977 issue of Analog. But let's go back even further than that. It was 1967 when I first came up with the idea of writing Ender's Game, of the story of Ender's Game. My older brother, Bill, was dating a girl named Laura Dean Lowe, who later, of course, became Mrs. Bill Card. And at the time, she was an avid science fiction reader. Bill was interested in science fiction also. And she introduced him to the Foundation trilogy. And knowing that I also was somewhat interested in science fiction, they gave me the first and third volumes, first Foundation and what is it called? It's just Foundation, that's what it is. And then Second Foundation by Isaac Asimov. They weren't able to pick up the middle book. But Isaac Asimov's magnum opus was wonderful for me. It was illuminating. I hadn't read science fiction in several years at that point, and not on a regular basis. And I plunged into that book, and it came to life for me. I've always admired Asimov. I still admire him as probably the finest writer of English prose in the American tradition, the plain tradition, where you don't have highly decorated and highly figured speech, but instead the narration is as clean and clear and the author is as invisible as possible. And as I read the Foundation trilogy, I came to realize that this is something that I really would like to do myself. I often tell young writers that there are two reasons for becoming a writer. One of them is you read something wonderful and you say, "Oh, wow, I want to be able to write like that." The other reason is you read something absolutely awful and you say, "Man, if that got published, I can write." Well, I always tell people that my motive for starting out as a writer was the latter. And it's really true. When I actually practically started writing, when I actually started setting words down on paper in a serious way, it was because I had seen some plays that I thought were pretty awful, and I thought, if that can be put on, I can write plays. And so I started doing it, and they were put on, and that was the beginning of my writing career. But my interest in becoming a writer actually was prompted by the first motive, and it was reading Isaac Asimov that made me think, I'd like to be able to do that. I'd like to be able to tell stories that can make people feel the way I feel when I'm reading Asimov's Foundation trilogy. So I set myself the task, then in 1967, I was 16 years old, set myself the task of figuring out what a good science fiction story would be. Now, at the time, the Vietnam War was on, and my brother Bill was in the military. In fact, he was stationed at Fort Douglas while he was dating Laura Dean, and he was recovering from a broken leg that happened while he was riding bikes with me and my younger brother, Russell, while Bill was on leave from the military. So he had already served in Korea for a while, and now he was stationed in Salt Lake City, and, close at hand. But I had been aware of all of his training. He had gone through basic training and had been an outstanding private in that setting. In fact, so outstanding that they moved him on to Officers Candidate School. But he washed himself out. He chose not to continue there because to him it just made no sense that they would try to train somebody to be an officer by breaking his will and treating him really badly. He felt like they should be treating them well and helping them to rely on their own sense of initiative. So he felt like it was a counterproductive training program, and from what he said, I believed it absolutely. So the issue of training, what good training would be, what bad training would be, was strongly in my mind. And I must confess also, of course, at the age of 16, I was only a year and a half, couple of years maybe away from being draft age at 18. And that had to, play a role in my thinking. And I remember at the time, what I feared most was basic training. I honestly didn't fear death. For one thing, anybody with a brain would know that somebody who types 80 to 100 words per minute was never going to be on the front lines anywhere. I was going to be in some office somewhere typing up some general's orders or something like that. My chances of actually being a grunt soldier in danger of losing life and limb in Vietnam were nil. But what I dreaded was basic training. I was not an athletic person. All of basic training, no matter what branch of the service you were going into, was going to be about climbing, ropes and going over obstacles and ducking under bullets. And I didn't mind the ducking under bullets, wasn't afraid of getting dirty. But the second I would have to climb up a rope hand over hand or chin myself, I had never been able to do a chin-up in my life. I was not strong. And I wasn't fat, but I was soft-bodied and had some extra weight. It was just not, the military was not something that I looked forward to. So training itself was an object of dread for me, personally. So with all of those thoughts in mind, my brother's experience with it, my dread of training, then I thought, okay, how do you turn this subject into a science fiction story? And I thought, okay, what if you're training for a future war, a war that will take place in space, a war where individual humans will go outside of ships and go from ship to ship in zero gravity? How do you train for that without losing soldiers? I mean, that's one of the, when they do live ammunition training in the military, there's a danger that if somebody sticks his head up, he'll get machine gun bullets in it. And that sort of puts an end to the investment that they've placed in your training. And so I thought, what do you do about the danger of somebody drifting off into space and being lost in the thick of mock combat during training? So I thought, okay, what they need to do is train them in zero gravity, but in an enclosed space. And that's when I came up with the idea of battle school, of having a cubed space, about a football field on a side, in which you could engage in combat, mock combat, of course, and train to start thinking the way you would need to train, the way you need to think, rather, in order to succeed in zero-gravity combat. Well, from there, it was a short step, and this was all still, of course, when I was 16, to realizing that it's not enough to protect them. You have to help them to think differently. And I had read Nordhoff and Hall's Bounty trilogy as a junior high student, and really loved it. It's a wonderful piece of history converted into a fictionalized account that really comes to life, especially for the young. I went on to read another book by Nordhoff and Hall, which was about World War I flying aces. And they talked about the training that these World War I pilots went through. There'd never been combat flying before. And they found out very quickly that one of the main ways that they lost pilots and planes, of course, was that the pilots thought only in the horizontal plane. They would look to the left, they'd look to the right, they'd even turn around and look behind them, and they'd find no enemies in view, and they'd think they were safe. The enemy that killed them would come from above, would come from out of the sun, would come from below them, and all of a sudden there'd be bullets flying, and they'd have no idea where the bullets were coming from, until, of course, they went down in flames. In space, the problem would be even more difficult because, of course, when you're flying an airplane, up and down still exist. They matter. But in space, there's not even an up and down. Every direction is up. Every direction is down. Every direction can be left or right depending on which way your body is twisted. So if you are thinking in any kind of terrestrial framework, any gravity-based framework, you'll be vulnerable to an enemy. You'll be thinking improperly. And so I thought one of the main things they have to do in zero-G is train them not to think like planet-bound people. Well, I thought that was a great idea. Battle School was going to be my science fiction story. But then I realized that I still had no story. All I had was a setting, and I had no idea who the story should be about, so the idea sat in the back of my mind for several years. I actually worked on another science fiction series that I had thought of. It became the Worthing Saga. I wrote several of those stories and did that in my teens before I went on my mission for the LDS Church to Brazil. And while I was in Brazil, I brought out this Battle School idea again and tried to come up with a story, and I still didn't have one. It wasn't until years later, 1975, I was working as an editor at Brigham Young University Press, and I was running a theater company, which I discovered that you can have a hit play, in fact, a season of hit plays, and lose money hand over fist. And I was funding it all out of season ticket sales. I mean, literally, I went out and sold season tickets at $20 each, and I was almost the only person selling, and most of the ticket sales were mine. And that was our budget. That was our funding, was however much money we brought in. So the incredible thing is that we were really only a few $100s in debt. But for me, on a copy editor's salary, how in the world was I going to repay the few $100s that we owed? So I realized I needed a supplemental income. And since I had utterly no skills whatsoever, I had no choice but either to take a job typing in the evenings or make some money as a writer. I felt like as a playwright I had talent, but they didn't pay you for that. I was losing money at that. So I tried my hand at fiction. And the first thing I did was dust off one of those Worthing stories that I had written before my mission, and I revised it, of course. I'd learned a little bit since then, and sent it off to Ben Bova at Analog. And he wrote back and said, I really like the way you write, but unfortunately the story is not science fiction, it's fantasy. But if you actually write a science fiction story, please send it to me. Well, at first I was outraged. How could he say that? The Worthing Saga is absolutely, definitely science fiction. But then I looked very closely and realized, of course, the story I sent him didn't include any of the surrounding information that let you know that it was on another planet, etc., etc. It just felt like a story about magic. And that was when I learned my rule, that the difference between science fiction and fantasy in this world is not any of the elaborate rules that you hear. The difference is simply this. Science fiction has rivets, fantasy has trees. If you look at the covers of science fiction and fantasy books, you'll find that I'm right. There's some kind of sheet metal or plastic smooth surface, usually with rivets in it, and that makes it science fiction. And if instead you see a bunch of trees and people going in a woodsy, elvesy setting, then you know you're dealing with fantasy. And so by that definition, the Worthing story that I had sent to Ben Bova was absolutely fantasy. But I did have this idea for Battle School in the back of my mind. And now I was serious. I needed money. And even though science fiction short stories didn't pay much, they paid more than I had, and that was enough for me. I knew I wasn't going to be able to break into the New Yorker for bigger bucks or Playboy magazine or any of the other magazines at the time that paid in the thousands of dollars. My best hope was to sell at 5 cents a word a science fiction short story. So I dusted off the Battle School idea, and now was when I had the insight that made it a story. I thought, if you're going to try to train people to not think in a planet-bound way, then what you need to do is get them when they're really young. And as soon as I realized that the people inside the battle school, inside the battle room, were kids, it changed everything. And I knew who my character was. My character was going to be the kid that had the most promise for saving the world from an alien invasion. Now that was in 1975. And of course I wrote it then, sent it off to Ben Bova. He rejected it, told me that it was twice as long as it needed to be. I needed to cut it in half. I just saw no way to cut it in half and still have anything left that was worth publishing. The story was only 70 pages long, but at 35 pages, I just didn't see it working. So instead, I sent the story off to Jim Bain, who was then the editor at Galaxy magazine. Well, Jim, let's put this kindly. Jim was going through stories about at the rate that Heinz ketchup flows out of the bottle. And so it was months and months and months before he finally got around to reading the story. And when he did, he rejected it. And unlike Ben, he didn't say, I'd like a revision, send it back. He just said, no, it doesn't work. So I went back to Ben's letter, and now his letter was looking a lot better to me. And so I thought, okay, he doesn't really want me to cut it in half. What he wants me to do is make it feel shorter. So what I realized was I had too many battles. I had too many scenes that were battles because I was showing off the battle room. And it was distracting from the story of the character. So I cut out one entire battle, and I cut another one down so that I just gave a brief summary of it. And that's it. I cut it down from 70 pages to 65 pages. I sent it back to Ben and said, I've dealt with the suggestions you made. See if this works now. I didn't actually lie and say I've cut it in half, but I figured, he's not going to remember. It's been a year since he saw the first version. In that original letter, he also suggested that instead of Ender's Game, which was clearly a silly title, I mean, it was designed, the kid was named Ender solely so that I could have a name that sounded like Endgame from chess. And so he suggested the title Professional Soldier, which had irony in it, and there was a lot to recommend it. But viscerally, it's not like I'm a genius at titles. Believe me, I have some really crummy ones in my past. But I knew that Professional Soldier was too generic. that the irony worked, but that there was nothing to make it stand out. And to me, the kid was named Ender now, and as long as he was named Ender, it might as well be Ender's Game. So I stuck with my title. I told him that in the letter, that while his title had much to recommend it, I preferred mine. And that's the title. That's the story I was offering him, was the story entitled Ender's Game at this length. And what I got back from Ben was much nicer than a letter. It was a check. Now, in those days, Analog was published by Condé Nast Publications, and their contract consisted of a statement printed on the back of the check that said, if you endorse this check, you have agreed to the following. And I didn't agree to the following, but that looked like the only way I was going to get the money, and I needed it. So I signed it, swallowed hard, and fortunately I was dealing with honorable people, and when the time came, the rights were reassigned to me as they needed to be and so forth. So I ended up not selling my soul the way I did with other publishers and other circumstances and other projects. It appeared in Analog magazine in the August 1977 issue. Of course, I was buying every issue of Analog then to watch when it would come out. And I remember that in the July issue of Analog, Ben had said in the little editor's note, "Next month will mark the debut of an exciting new writer." Well, I knew he meant me, so I was so excited. So then the August 1977 issue appears, and guess what? On the cover, with all the splashy picture and the big name, is the story Cold Cash War by Robert Lynn Asprin. His first appearance in print. He was the author that Ben was talking about. And yes, Ender's Game was in there on page 100, but no special touting of the story, no special attention called to me. My name wasn't on the cover. It just appeared. Now, I was, of course, disappointed, a little bit hurt. What I didn't realize was that Ben was, in fact, setting me up exactly the way he should, which is he let the readers discover the story. He did nothing to tout it. It appeared in the magazine, and the result was that without any hype from him, just the appearance of the story, Ender's Game was adopted by readers. It came in second for the Hugo Award. It was on the strength of that story that I was given the John W. Campbell Award for Best New Writer. There are, of course, people who still feel that was a gross miscarriage of justice, but my mother and I agree that I deserved to win it. And the foundation of my career. It wasn't until years later that I decided to write a novel of Ender's Game. So in a way, while this is, of course, the 20th anniversary of the publication of the book, it's the 30th anniversary of the publication of the story in 2005. And for me, it's even longer since I first thought of it. But since I first thought of the Battle Room. But since I first came up with the story, that was 1975. And for me, that's where it began, was realizing that it was a kid named Ender who was the hero of the story. And I remember sitting there when I started writing it. I had gone up with a girlfriend at the time to a circus that was playing in the Salt Palace in Salt Lake City. But I wasn't invited to the circus. She was taking her boss's children. She worked at Chuckarama in Orem, a smorgasbord restaurant, and as a favor to her boss, she was taking his kids to the circus. There were 3 tickets. None of them was for me. So I sat on the lawn outside the Salt Palace with a notebook. Now, I've been writing my plays this way forever. I used to sit in the Harris Fine Arts Center waiting for my dad to pick me up because, of course, I didn't get a driver's license till I was 22. That's another story. So I'd be waiting to be picked up to be taken home from BYU after a day at school. And since it took him 20 minutes to get there, I'd have time to write. And there were other times when I was waiting for this, waiting for that. So I'd pull out my notebook and write my plays in longhand. So I started Ender's Game in longhand as well. And I remember the very first thing I wrote was, "Remember, the enemy's gate is down." And that's the only sentence from the short story that I left in the novel when I did that adaptation. Now, the adaptation into a novel, the thing we're remembering here on the 20th anniversary, began almost as an accident. For me, Ender's Game was done. I'd finished the story. It was complete. I had no desire to write a novel, but I did have another novel that I was working on called Speaker for the Dead. And Speaker for the Dead, which ended up also winning the Hugo and Nebula Award, though it's not as popular a book, mainly because it's much more for grown-ups. It doesn't have a kid protagonist. It's a much slower beginning book. but many people think a better one. I won't argue with them. My idea of a happy future is a world in which every household in America is riven by dissent over whether Ender's Game or A Speaker for the Dead is the better of the two books. But for now, I'll settle for we'll talk about Ender's Game. But I was working on Speaker for the Dead, and what brought that book to life was the realization this really works if the hero is Ender Wiggin after the fact. Only instead of being hailed as a hero, he is not. He's rejected because he wiped out all of this alien race. And so it was with that turnabout that I opened up the book Speaker for the Dead. The trouble was, if I included that turnabout as the opening of Speaker for the Dead, it took me 20 or 30, 40, in one draft, 50 pages before I even got to the beginning of the story of Speaker for the Dead. It was a deadly, tedious opening. It wasn't working. But Speaker for the Dead was under contract to Tom Doherty at Tor. So at the time I was working for Compute Magazine as their book publisher, and on their behalf, I was attending, well, now it's BEA, the Book Expo America, but at the time it was the ABA, American Booksellers Association Convention, in Dallas, Texas. And I ran into Tom Doherty there and took him aside. We walked through the noisy convention floor, and I explained to him that in order to write Speaker for the Dead successfully as a novel, I needed to adapt Ender's Game first, solely in order to change the ending of Ender's Game in order to set up Speaker for the Dead. Well, in a handshake, in fact, not even literally a handshake, Tom Doherty said, "Same terms as Speaker for the Dead?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "Great, it's done." And a few days later, my agent got a contract, we signed it, and instead of writing the next version of Speaker for the Dead, I sat down and started writing Ender's Game. Then I worked on fleshing out the story. I had already learned from my work on the novel Songmaster that the way to take a short story and adapt it into a novel is not to start with the short story as written and then tack a bunch of stuff onto the end. The way you do it is you go before the beginning of the short story, and you create a much wider world, and you develop the character much more thoroughly. Now, Ender's Game started with Ender, 9 years old, the short story version. So I went back to when he was born, when he was so little that it was ridiculous to try to do a war novel about him. But it wasn't, not with Ender, and not with the situation in Battle School, and not with the emergency that the world was facing. So I started with Ender back on Earth before he ever got to Battle School, whereas the short story started when he first got command of his own army, and took it from there. I gave him a brother and a sister. They sort of grew like Topsy. They became much more important in the book than I ever planned. Peter and Valentine weren't even in the outline that I had, but they became vital to not only that story, but to the later books in the Ender series. And I really had fun writing this book. I was playing because I knew the real book was Speaker for the Dead. So I followed whims. The whole fantasy game, that just came out of nowhere. I was free associating. It's not Ender's brain you're seeing at work there. It's mine. So if you detect schizophrenia or some other vile mental disorder in the fantasy game, that's mine, not his. But by the time I was done, I knew I had something. In fact, about halfway through, I thought, this story is really working. This book is going to go somewhere. And I was modeling Ender, not the character, not the character attributes, but the way he talked, the level of language he used on my then 5-year-old son, Jeffrey. And I thought, Jeffrey's going to read this book, and he's going to read it young. I don't want him to learn bad words from my book. And the book was thick with them. I had these kids talking the way little kids would talk, especially if they were in a military school setting. Lots of bad language, lots of blasphemy, and I was just uncomfortable with it. I thought, I don't want Jeffrey to learn these words from me or any other kid. So I went through, cleaned up the language. I left in all of the bathroom humor because, you can't write about kids honestly without having that there. But I made it so that no kid was going to learn bad language from me. And that was solely because I knew this book was going to be read by kids. Then I finished and sent the book off to my editor, who at the time was Harriet McDougall, who, by sheer coincidence, is the wife of Robert Jordan, the author of the Wheel of Time series, though at that time he was still writing Conan stories for Tom Doherty. The Wheel of Time had not started appearing. And so, it's a very incestuous, small world in science fiction. Harriet was thrilled with the book. She thought it was wonderful, and she was as excited as I was. They were so excited that Tom decided that as they started a new hardcover line, because at that time Tor was only a paperback publisher. They published nothing in hardcover. They were going to have their first novel in hardcover be Ender's Game in December of 1984. Well, this is what my ambition for this novel was at the time. I called up my editor and I said, Harriet, we can't release it. I'm flattered to be the first hardcover, but we can't do that. If you put it out in December of 84, that's right at the end of the Hugo eligibility time period, the year. And if the year ends and they start nominating as they do in January, no one will have read Ender's Game. Nobody buys a hardcover that comes out in December, certainly not science fiction readers. They're all poor. They wait till it comes out in paperback. So if you just wait and bring out the hardcover in January of 85, then it'll have the whole year in hardcover, and the paperback can come out before the nominations, and this book will have a chance at making the ballot. If you bring it out in hardcover in December, no chance. It'll just disappear as far as the awards are concerned. Well, she saw the reasoning of that. They brought out a book by another author, I believe Gordon Dixon, as their first book in December of their first hardcover in December of 84. And Ender's Game came out in January of 1985. And the eligibility worked as I had hoped. It had time for readers to discover it. And the result was that it was on the ballot and ended up winning the Hugo Award, which is what I was aiming for. I was stunned when it also won the Nebula Award. It seemed to me too popular a kind of novel, a novel too much aimed at the common denominator of readers to win the Nebula. So I was naturally thrilled when it won that award as well. And then Speaker for the Dead, the sequel, went on to win both awards also the following year. But I didn't set out to write a Hugo-winning book, but I was able to tell when I was finished with writing Ender's Game that it was the kind of story that would be in contention. That was 20 years ago. Since then, of course, immediately attention came from Hollywood. As a matter of fact, it was the short story that prompted the first option that a movie producer took on Ender's Game. The novel was out, but he hadn't read it. He didn't know about it. He had read the short story only. And it was the same producer who had produced, or who was at that point working on Enemy Mine, a story by Barry Longyear, which was based in turn on Hell in the Pacific, which was a movie. So adapting a story that was based on a movie into a movie again, you would have thought it would be foolproof. But instead, Enemy Mine tanked, and that original option on Ender's Game expired along with the producer's sources of funding. But that first option taught me a valuable lesson. Because as soon as the option was signed, what the producer said to me was, of course, we have to change Ender to be 16 years old and give him a love interest. And I was horrified. I said, first of all, these kids are supposed to be geniuses. If Ender is 16, there is no 16-year-old with even half a brain who is going to believe everything that adults tell him. Ender has to be so young and have lived in such a sheltered environment that he still believes everything that adults tell him. And 16-year-olds aren't like that. Especially not really smart 16-year-olds, especially not the kind of 16-year-olds with the initiative and the brain power to save the world as a military commander. But they wouldn't listen to me. And why? And it wasn't just this producer. It was producer after producer over the next few years. After that option expired, everybody that came to me said, well, of course, we can't leave Ender as a little kid. And they would all explain to me why. First of all, they had to get that date audience. How in the world will we make the money back on this movie unless we have people on dates? And people on dates need 16, 17, 18-year-old heroes. They need to see themselves. Nobody that age, nobody in their teens is going to care about what happens to a 6 or 9 or 10-year-old kid. I said, well, wait a minute. What about E.T.? Where's the teen hero in E.T.? It was a huge hit. Well, that was a special movie, they would tell me. I said, great, let's make Ender's Game a special movie too. Well, apparently they didn't have the vision to see how that would work. The real problem, and this one was not just Hollywood silliness, is that when you have a movie that absolutely depends on a child actor, you're shooting yourself in the foot. Because how many good child actors have there been? I'm not talking about child actors who were in hit movies. I'm talking about children who can really, really act. There have been a few. Elijah Wood was a child actor like that. Obviously, Haley Joel Osment. A couple of others further back, Roddy McDowall, marvelous child actor, and others whose names are slipping my mind right now. But there's never been more than one at a time in any given year. I mean, in order to make The Good Son, they had to cast Elijah Wood with Macaulay Culkin, which means you had a face and a talented actor. That was what was going to happen to Ender's Game. Well, Ender's Game, to be filmed, needed not just Ender, but a half dozen other kids to be excellent, excellent actors. It's almost an impossible thing to do. In fact, it still was a worry, even after Ender's Game was subsequently optioned very seriously in the project that's going on right now. Still a concern until I saw the movie Peter Pan, the live-action Peter Pan directed by Hogan. In that film, it absolutely depends on the performance of children. And yes, the character of Peter Pan was cast with the kid has a marvelous look, a magical look, but the director got a good performance out of him. And all the other kids gave excellent performances. All the Lost Boys, the Indian Princess, the brothers and Wendy, they gave wonderful performances. It can be done. And that encouraged me no end. But by then, Ender's Game was under the option that finally worked. But here's how that came about. Probably more than you're going to want to know, but they told me I could talk as long as I wanted to, and then they'd still managed to fit it onto 9 CDs. Either that or they'll edit out these comments too, so you won't even hear them. So if you do hear them, you know that they kept their promise and everything that I wanted to say is in here. But I was obviously still shopping this around and saying no to everybody, because everybody would say, we got to make Ender 16. And I would say, no, it's got to be in the contract that you don't have any right to make this movie if Ender is played any older than 12. He has to, in fact, I specified he has to be played as being under 12 years of age. I wanted it so that there was no chance of puberty rearing its ugly head. I didn't want to have any chance that they would give Ender a date during the movie. I didn't want him to fall in love with anybody. I wanted him to be a boy, a kid. To me, that was essential. So I would insist that they include that clause. And I had a couple who agreed, okay, we'll do it that way. We'll put in that clause. But then I would read the contract, and these were, Hollywood contracts, so they were thicker than most novels. And sure enough, 40 pages later into the contract, there'd be a little clause buried in the middle of a paragraph that had nothing to do with this subject that said, contrary to any statement anywhere else in this contract, Ender may be played at any age, or, casting will be solely at the discretion, et cetera, et cetera. Something that erased that clause so that I would see the visible clause, and they hoped that I wouldn't notice the clause later in the contract that said that they didn't have to do it after all. Well, that told me that not only couldn't I sign that contract, I didn't want to work with these people. Contrary to public opinion, you don't have to be dishonest to work in Hollywood. In fact, most people who are really dishonest in Hollywood fail, because a collaborative project, like any good movie, absolutely depends on trust. There are lots and lots of crooks in Hollywood, but very few of them are making movies. The people who are making good movies are honest people. They're able to maintain the level of trust with their fellow workers that enables everybody to do their best work. So I wasn't going to do any business with those guys. Then there were the other guys who would say they would use their best efforts to play Ender as being under 12 years. Well, best efforts means at some point, long before shooting starts, two guys are sitting in a conference room in the studio, and they say, well, what do you think? Should Ender be under 12? And the other guy would go, nah. And that's it. That was best efforts right there, because they'd say, well, we couldn't do it. The studio executives wouldn't do it, and they're the ones with the money, so we did our best efforts, but Ender's going to be 16 now. So that clause didn't work. And then there were the people who said, whose contract said, we'll make Ender under 12, give or take 4 years. Well, I can add, I didn't think they were going to make him under 8. That was solely designed to make it so that he could be played as a 16-year-old. So once again, not doing business with these guys. Finally, I found the producer who got it. And that's the producer that I ended up originally signing with long before the current option with the studio. That producer was Robert Chartoff. Ted Ravenette, a friend of his who was a play producer and a film producer, had found Ender's Game, brought it to Chartoff. And Chartoff read it, loved it, and they got it. They knew that Ender had to be played under 12, and they understood why. And they were going to fight for that. And Robert Chartoff's producing partner, Lynn Hendy, who is a marvelous producer and a joy to work with, and became the active producer on this, the one that I worked most closely with. She got it, and they agreed that I would write the screenplay. And in order to sell the project, I wrote screenplays for which I was not paid. Officially, I'm not supposed to do that, but I wasn't union labor, and I was adapting my own books, so I sort of fit in through the cracks. I wrote one draft, and it was a good draft, but the heart wasn't there, and we didn't understand why. None of us were understanding what wasn't working. It wasn't what I left out. It wasn't that I was too faithful to the original book. In fact, I sometimes appalled them by how unfaithful I was. But I knew what the essence of the story was, and so I was able to strip away a lot of things that really weren't necessary. But somehow the emotions just weren't coming through. People would read the book and be thrilled, and then they'd read the screenplay and they'd go, it's just not there. And they couldn't say why. I tried again. My second full draft from ground zero with a completely different approach. And once again, it was better, it was closer, but it wasn't there. It wasn't until on a completely related project, and I'll probably talk about it more on the audiobook version of that book, a book called Ender's Shadow, which was something, believe me, I never planned to write. But for various reasons, I found myself writing a novel that was exactly parallel to Ender's Game, only it focused on the character of Bean. It saw all of the same events through Bean's eyes. And as soon as that book existed, though I didn't see it at first, the key to Ender's Game the movie had now been found. It took the interest of Richard LaGravenese in working on Ender's Game. He thought that the book was terrific. He wanted to be involved. He's a great screenwriter. But it was his wife, Anne, who first said, no, you don't adapt Ender's Game. You adapt Ender's Game and Ender's Shadow. And she was dead on. As soon as I heard that from her, I realized that she had found that key. My novel, Ender's Shadow, was the way to make Ender's Game, not by filming Ender's Shadow, because that's not Ender's story, that's Bean's story, but by focusing on the relationship between Ender and Bean, we solved the fundamental movie-making problem with Ender's Game. And here's what the problem was. Ender's Game takes place inside Ender's head. The only way you understand the horrible moral dilemmas that he's facing, the only reason you care deeply about him, the only reason that you're so emotionally involved, is that you're inside his head throughout the entire novel. And movies can't do that. Movies can't tell you what the character is thinking. I mean, they can. They can give you voiceovers, for example. So Ender's walking along a corridor in battle school, and suddenly you hear his voice. He's not speaking, but you know you're getting his thoughts. And he says, I wonder what Peter's doing right now. What a dreadful way to handle Ender's thoughts. It wouldn't work. Or you have the character talk about his thoughts and feelings, which is the standard thing you do in movies. But with Ender's Game, Ender is a quiet guy. He doesn't reveal his feelings. If he does, he's not Ender. So there's no way to tell you what he's feeling. But as soon as you bring Bean into the story as an equal or nearly equal character, now you have what Hollywood is good at, a buddy movie. You have two characters who are at first antagonistic, then later become allies in a struggle against adults. The adults are trying to decide which of them is going to be the commander that they need in order to save the world, so that even when they're cooperating, the adults are still seeing a competition between them. And right up to the last minute, it's there in Ender's Game, it's explicit in Ender's Shadow, we don't know which of them is going to be in command at the final battle. Now that's the story Hollywood could tell. And not only that, we could tell it more briefly. My first script that included both Ender's Game and Ender's Shadow was 20 pages shorter than any script I had ever written from Ender's Game alone. It was doable. And my script proved that it could be done because that script had the emotional impact. Now, no studio can ever justify spending $120 million to make a movie based on a script written by the author who has never had a movie made before. So they have other writers coming in, and I'm sure that the draft I wrote is not even going to be close to what the final draft is. Nevertheless, I proved that the emotional impact could be there and that the problems could be solved. And I was happy. I'm perfectly willing to let them go ahead. Well, based on that take on the adaptation, Warner Brothers got involved with Wolfgang Peterson attached to direct, and we'll see if this packaging ends up being the one that goes onto the screen. If it does, that'll be great. The irony, though, is that everybody who read Ender's Game immediately started saying, oh, that book is so good, it ought to be a movie. Think about it for a minute. It's already a book. You know, Shakespeare's stuff was great before it was a movie. Dickens's novels were great before they were made into a movie. But in America today, film is the premier art form. Anything that we think is wonderful, we want to turn into a movie so that it can be made perfect, because that's what we view as the epitome, the acme of art, of the storytelling art. And I accept that. I'm an American. You know, I want to see these things filmed. I wanted to see the Harry Potter movie, and was delighted when finally, with the third Harry Potter movie, they got it right. We want to see movies made from books, but the fact of the matter is, film is not the ideal setting for a book by Orson Scott Card. And that's because my background is in theater. And when I'm writing books, I'm not really writing prose. What I'm doing is I'm improvising a performance, an oral performance. My narration is meant to be read aloud. I'm never happier than when people tell me, oh, when I was reading the Alvin Maker books, or when I read Ender's Game, my wife and I read it aloud to each other, or my dad read this book to us at bedtime when I was a kid, or my teacher read Ender's Game to us in our classes. That's what I want to hear, because my stuff needs to be read aloud. And that's why, for me, I hope the film is wonderful. I'll make a lot of money if it is. But for me, the ideal presentation of any book of mine is to have excellent actors perform it in an audio-only format. And that's what you have right here. That's what you just listened to. I've had a lot of productions over the years, audio productions of my books. Back in the days of abridgment, it didn't work as well. Because my stories don't abridge well. I brought a lot of habits from my playwriting days to my fiction writing. And when I was a playwright, I was a bare stage playwright. I didn't believe in realistic sets. I didn't want them. I wanted all my plays performed on Shakespeare's stage. I wanted it so that you knew what setting you were in because of the words that were said and the dialogue between the actors. If I wanted you to think you were in the Forest of Arden, then like Shakespeare, I would say, well, here we are in the Forest of Arden. But unless it was essential to the story, you would never see anything. So I don't describe. You know, I've had people say, I hated the graphic descriptions of violence in your book. Well, I will challenge them. Where? What graphic description? And they can't find it. And I say, well, then guess where the graphic description of the violence came from? Came from your head. You imagined it. Well, of course, I wanted them to imagine it, and I really am still responsible to a degree for what they see in their minds when they read my books. But there's no description. There are no incidents that are there as filler. There's no fluff. There's no empty dialogue. I try to write with the discipline of a playwright so that if there's dialogue, it's because the words that are said are essential to understand the forward movement of the story or to understand the characters. So my books do not abridge well. Even so, I was still delighted to have my books coming out in audio, even in abridged format. There was one in particular, one abridged production of my novel Lost Boys, read by Robbie Benson. He did a splendid job, and even though enormous swaths of the book, whole characters, were cut out in order to make the abridgment, I felt like the story worked. But I have to say, I'm delighted that finally my books are coming out regularly in unabridged format with excellent productions. And I have to give credit to the man who was the main reader of this book, Stefan Rudnitsky, who is not just the reader, he's also the producer, the director. When he looks at these books, he doesn't look at them as just having some guy come in and read them. He looks at the theatrical potential. He's somebody who understands oral storytelling. He casts the voices splendidly, with the one exception that he allowed me to make my vanity cameo. Just see if you can guess which voice in this production that you just heard was mine, because I'm in it. Anyway, he does a great job on this and many other productions, whether he's the reader or merely the director and producer, of putting out the kind of production that I want my books to have. So when the movie comes out, when it's finally made, I hope you'll go see it. I hope it makes billions of dollars all around the world and allows me to have the power in Hollywood to get more of my projects made. But in the meantime, you already have what I think of as the ideal presentation of my novel Ender's Game, which is the audiobook that you have just heard.
We hope you've enjoyed Ender's Game, an audio renaissance audiobook from Tor Forge. This program was produced by Stefan Rudnicki and remastered by Tim Franklin. Text copyright 1977, 1985, and 1981 by Orson Scott Card. Production copyright 2002 and 2004 by Audio Renaissance, a division of Holtzbrink Publishers, LLC. All rights reserved.